In the autumn of 138 BCE, a young man knelt before the most powerful ruler on earth and accepted a mission that everyone around him believed was a death sentence. Jiang Qian was perhaps 30 years old, a minor official in the court of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, and he had just volunteered to walk into the unknown. His task was deceptively simple: cross the western frontier of China, traverse territories controlled by the Xiongnu, the feared nomadic confederacy that had terrorized the empire's northern borders for generations, and find a people called the Eurasia, who had been driven from their homeland years earlier by those same Xiongnu horsemen. The emperor wanted an alliance. Jiang Qian would be his messenger. He would carry with him a small escort of around 100 men, a jade staff of imperial authority, and a set of instructions that assumed he would reach a destination no Chinese envoy had ever visited. The court astrologers consulted the heavens. The omens were ambiguous. Beyond the Jade Gate, the empire's westernmost outpost, the world simply stopped being known. The maps ended. The rumors began. Somewhere out there, past the deserts that swallowed armies and the mountains that scraped the sky, lay peoples and kingdoms and landscapes that no one in the Chinese court could describe with any certainty. Jiang Qian walked through the Jade Gate and into the silence beyond it, and in doing so he took the first step along a path that would eventually stretch from the Pacific coast to the shores of the Mediterranean, connecting half the world in a web of trade, faith, disease, and human longing that would endure for nearly 2,000 years. He would not return for 13 years. And the world he described when he finally stumbled back into the emperor's court, gaunt, weathered, accompanied by only one of his original companions, would change the course of human civilization. What we know of Jiang Qian's journey comes primarily from the Shiji, the records of the grand historian, compiled by Sima Qian, one of the most extraordinary minds in ancient historiography. Sima Qian was a contemporary of Jiang Qian, serving as grand historian at the Han court during the reign of Emperor Wu. He interviewed Jiang Qian directly, recorded his observations of the western lands with meticulous care, and preserved details of geography, trade goods, population estimates, and local customs that would not be independently verified by other sources for centuries. His account is supplemented by the later Hanshu, the Book of Han, compiled by Bangu in the 1st century CE, which drew on the court archives and diplomatic records to flesh out the picture of early Silk Road contact. Together, these sources give us our earliest window into the network of routes that a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen would not christen the Seidenstrasse, the Silk Road, until 1877, nearly 2 millennia after Jiang Qian's boots first touched the sand beyond the Jade Gate. But to understand why a young official would accept a mission that amounted to walking off the edge of the known world, we must first understand the world he walked out of, an empire gripped by fear, ambition, and the memory of humiliation. The Han dynasty that Jiang Qian served was only 60 years old when he set out on his journey, but it already carried the weight of centuries of Chinese civilization on its shoulders. China in the 2nd century BCE was not a young culture finding its feet. It was an ancient one recovering from trauma. The preceding Qin dynasty, the dynasty that gave China its name, had unified the warring states through sheer military brutality, built the first iteration of the Great Wall, standardized weights and measures and the written script, and then collapsed in a spasm of rebellion and civil war barely 15 years after its founding. The Han dynasty rose from that wreckage, founded by Liu Bang, a man of common birth who had clawed his way to the throne through a combination of military cunning, political pragmatism, and the good fortune of outlasting his rivals. By the time Emperor Wu took the throne in 141 BCE, the Han had consolidated their power, reformed their administration, and built an empire that stretched from the tropical coasts of the south to the dry grasslands of the north. But the north was the problem. It had always been the problem. Beyond the northern frontier, stretching across the vast Eurasian steppe from Manchuria to the edges of Central Asia, lived the Xiongnu. They were a nomadic confederacy. not a single tribe, but an alliance of peoples bound together under a supreme leader called the Chanyu. They rode horses with a skill that seemed almost supernatural to the settled Chinese, their composite bows short and powerful, and could be fired at full gallop with lethal accuracy at distances that made Chinese infantry formations feel like slow-moving targets. They appeared on the horizon like weather, sudden, violent, and impossible to pin down. When Chinese armies marched north to engage them, the Xiongnu simply melted into the steppe, only to reappear behind the army supply lines, cutting off retreat and turning pursuit into disaster. The relationship between China and the Xiongnu had been one of chronic, humiliating accommodation. In 200 BCE, Liu Bang himself, the founder of the Han dynasty, had led a massive army north to confront the Xiongnu Chanyu Modu, and been trapped on a frozen hilltop called Baiding for 7 days, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of mounted warriors. He escaped only through diplomatic bribery and what the court historians delicately described as negotiations. The resulting policy, known as Heikin, amounted to paying the Xiongnu not to attack. China sent silk, grain, wine, and princesses northward across the frontier, and the Xiongnu generally refrained from burning Chinese cities to the ground, generally. The arrangement was expensive, demeaning, and never fully reliable. Xiongnu raiding parties still crossed the border with regularity, carrying off livestock, grain, and people. The frontier provinces lived in a state of permanent anxiety. Emperor Wu was not the kind of man who accepted anxiety as a permanent condition. He had ascended the throne at 15, and by his mid-20s he had already begun transforming China's posture from defensive to aggressively expansionist. He was brilliant, ruthless, prone to grandiose visions, and surrounded by advisors who understood that their survival depended on feeding those visions with actionable intelligence. When reports reached the court that the Eurasia, a people the Xiongnu had defeated and driven westward years earlier, might still harbor resentment against their conquerors, the emperor saw an opportunity. If he could find the Eurasia and forge an alliance, the Xiongnu would face enemies on two fronts. The steppe that had always been China's nightmare could become a trap. He needed a messenger. Someone brave enough or desperate enough to cross Xiongnu territory, survive the deserts beyond, find a people who might have scattered to the winds, and return with their answer. Jiang Qian stepped forward. What we know of Jiang Qian before this moment is frustratingly sparse. Sima Qian describes him as a man of strong physique and generous spirit, someone who inspired trust in others, qualities that suggest both physical resilience and social intelligence. He held the rank of Lang, a palace attendant, which placed him in the lower rungs of the court hierarchy, visible enough to volunteer, insignificant enough that his loss would cost the emperor nothing. His motivations are lost to history. Perhaps he sought advancement, perhaps he believed in the mission. Perhaps he was young enough to mistake the unknown for adventure rather than death. Whatever his reasons, he accepted the jade staff, gathered his escort of 100 men, and departed Chang'an, the Han capital, a city of perhaps 500,000 souls, yet the largest on earth at that time, heading northwest toward the frontier and the silence beyond it. The man who would become his most important companion was not Chinese at all. Ganfu was a Xiongnu, either a captive or a defector who had entered Han service. He was skilled with the bow, familiar with the steppe, and capable of surviving in terrain that would kill men who relied on settled civilization's comforts. Sima Qian mentions him almost in passing, but Ganfu's presence in the expedition was not incidental. He was the thread connecting Jiang Qian to the nomadic world he was about to enter, a translator, a guide, and eventually the only other man who would survive the journey. Within days of crossing the frontier, the expedition was captured by the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu did not kill Jiang Qian. This was not mercy, it was strategy. The Chanyu at the time, a man named Junchen, immediately grasped the implications of a Chinese envoy heading west to seek an alliance with the Eurasia. He is reported to have said something to the effect of, "The Eurasia live to the north of me. How can the Han send an envoy to them? If I wish to send an envoy south through Han territory to the kingdom of Yue, would the Han allow it? The logic was impeccable. Zhang Qian was not executed, but he was not released either. He was absorbed into Xiongnu society, given a wife, expected to settle, monitored, but not imprisoned. The Chanyu apparently believed that time and comfort would erode Zhang Qian's sense of mission. He underestimated his captive. Zhang Qian lived among the Xiongnu for approximately 10 years, a decade. He learned their language, their customs, their patterns of movement across the steppe. He fathered at least one child with his Xiongnu wife. By every external measure, he had become one of them. But Sima Qian records that throughout those years, Zhang Qian kept the jade staff of his imperial commission, never once relinquishing the symbol of his mission. When the moment came when Xiongnu attention was diverted by some internal crisis or border conflict that the sources do not specify, Zhang Qian fled westward, taking Ganfu and whatever companions remained. What followed was a journey across some of the most punishing terrain on the planet. Zhang Qian crossed the Taklamakan Desert. The name itself is often translated with varying degrees of accuracy as, "You go in and you don't come out." It is a sea of shifting sand dunes, some rising over 100 meters, all covering an area larger than modern Germany. Temperatures swing from blistering heat during the day to bitter cold at night. Water sources are separated by distances that can exceed 100 kilometers. Sandstorms can bury a caravan in hours. The oasis towns that cling to the desert's edges survive on snowmelt from distant mountains, and the spaces between them are among the most inhospitable environments human beings have ever attempted to cross. Zhang Qian survived it. How precisely, the sources do not say. Perhaps he followed the southern or northern rim of the Taklamakan, where oases provided periodic relief. Perhaps Ganfu's steppe survival skills kept them alive between water sources. Perhaps they joined local trading parties who knew the routes. The historical record offers only the result. Zhang Qian emerged on the other side and entered the kingdom of Dayuan, which scholars generally identify with the Fergana Valley in modern Uzbekistan. What he found there astonished him. Dayuan was not a wilderness. It was a settled, prosperous kingdom with walled cities, cultivated fields, and a population that Sima Qian estimated at several 100,000. The people grew rice and wheat, made wine from grapes, a practice that fascinated Zhang Qian, since winemaking was unknown in Han China, and raised what the Chinese sources describe with barely concealed awe, the heavenly horses of Fergana. These were tall, powerful animals, vastly superior to the small steppe ponies the Chinese use for cavalry. Their sweat, according to Zhang Qian's report, ran red, a detail that modern scholars attribute either to a parasitic skin condition or to the horse's exertion at high altitude, causing subcutaneous blood vessels to become visible. Whatever the explanation, the horses of Fergana would become an obsession for Emperor Wu, who would later send armies to acquire them, believing they were descended from dragons and that possessing them would ensure his immortality. But Zhang Qian was not in Fergana to admire horses. He pressed on westward, seeking the Eurasia. His hosts in Dayuan, recognizing the value of maintaining good relations with the distant but powerful Han Empire, provided guides and interpreters who escorted him through the kingdom of Kangju, roughly modern southern Kazakhstan, and finally into the territory where the Eurasia had resettled. He found them. And what he found was not what the emperor had hoped for. The Eurasia had been transformed by their westward migration. Driven from their original homeland near the Chinese frontier by the Xiongnu, they had wandered across the steppe for years before conquering the Greek-influenced kingdom of Bactria, the remnant of Alexander the Great's eastern conquests, located in what is now northern Afghanistan and southern Uzbekistan. The land was rich, the cities were sophisticated. The Eurasia had, in the space of a generation, gone from displaced refugees to comfortable rulers of a prosperous agricultural region. They had no interest whatsoever in marching back across thousands of kilometers of desert and steppe to fight the Xiongnu on behalf of a Chinese emperor they had never met. Zhang Qian spent about a year among the Yuezhi by trying to persuade them. He failed, but in that year, and in his time in Dayuan, Kongju, and Bactria, he did something far more consequential than securing a military alliance. He observed. He asked questions. He gathered intelligence with the systematic curiosity of a born explorer, recording details about trade routes, local products, population sizes, military capabilities, and, crucially, the goods that move between these kingdoms and others even further west. He learned of the Parthian Empire to the west, of kingdoms in India to the south, and of trade networks that connected these distant lands in ways that no one in the Chinese court had imagined. One detail in particular caught his attention. In the markets of Bactria, he found bamboo and cloth that he recognized as products of Shu, the southwestern Chinese province of Sichuan. When he asked how they had arrived, he was told they came through India via trade routes that passed through the mountainous regions of what is now Yunnan and Myanmar. This meant that Chinese goods were already reaching Central Asia through indirect southern routes, passing through intermediaries who added their own margins at every step. The implication was staggering. There were already connections between China and the Western world. They were simply unrecognized, uncontrolled, and enormously profitable for everyone except China. Zhang Qian turned homeward. The return journey was, if anything, more harrowing than the outward one. He attempted a southern route to avoid Xiongnu territory, in passing through the Tibetan Plateau's edges, but was captured again by Xiongnu forces. This second captivity lasted about a year before internal Xiongnu conflicts, a succession crisis following the death of the Chanyu, created enough chaos for Zhang Qian and Ganfu to escape once more. They rode east, crossing frontier after frontier until they finally reached Chinese territory and made their way back to Chang'an. 13 years after his departure, Zhang Qian stood before Emperor Wu and delivered his report. Of the 100 men who had set out with him, only he and Ganfu had returned. His body bore the marks of everything he had endured, the deserts, the captivities, the mountain crossings, the diseases that haunted every traveler in unfamiliar lands. But his mind carried something worth more than any military alliance: a map of the world. He described Dayuan and its heavenly horses. He described the Yuezhi and their conquered kingdom. He described Parthia, the vast empire that controlled the land between the Euphrates and the Hindu Kush. He described India and its populations and its exotic goods. He described trade routes that connected all of these places in a web of exchange that had existed in some form for centuries, but that China had never consciously participated in. He described a world that was far larger, far richer, and far more interconnected than anyone in the Chinese court had believed possible. Emperor Wu was electrified. The military alliance with the Yuezhi had failed, but something far more important had succeeded. And Zhang Qian had opened a window onto a wider world, and through that window poured not just intelligence, but possibility. If Chinese goods were already reaching Bactria through roundabout southern routes, what might happen if China established direct connections westward? If the kingdoms of Central Asia possessed goods and animals that China lacked, what might China offer in return? The answer was obvious, and it had been obvious for centuries to everyone who had ever touched it. Silk. To understand why silk became the single most consequential trade good in human history, you must first understand what it was and what it was not. Silk was not merely a fabric. It was a technology, a currency, a diplomatic tool, a marker of status, a religious offering, and a mystery all woven into a single luminous thread. The production of silk from the cocoons of the Bombyx mori silkworm had been practiced in China for at least 3,000 years before Zhang Qian's journey. Archaeological evidence from sites in Zhejiang province suggests that silk cultivation, or sericulture, may date to the 4th or 5th millennium BCE, making it one of the oldest continuous technologies in human history. By the time of the Han Dynasty, it had been refined to an extraordinary degree of sophistication. The entire process, from the careful cultivation of mulberry trees whose leaves fed the silkworms, to the precise timing of cocoon harvesting, to the delicate unreeling of the single continuous filament that each cocoon produced, to the spinning, dyeing, and weaving of the finished fabric, was a closely guarded state secret. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China was death. The fabric itself was unlike anything else the ancient world produced. A single silk filament is finer than a human hair, yet pound for pound stronger than steel. When woven, it produces a fabric that is simultaneously light and warm, that drapes against the body with a fluid elegance that no other material can match, that takes dye with a depth and vibrancy that makes other fabrics look dull, and that has a natural luster, a subtle sheen that seems to glow from within. In an age when most people wore rough wool, scratchy linen, or animal skins, silk was something close to miraculous. It was the ancient world's most advanced material technology, and China had a complete monopoly on its production. Silk served multiple functions within Chinese society itself. It was, of course, a luxury fabric worn by the elite, but it was also a form of currency. Bolts of silk were used to pay taxes, salaries, and tribute. The government maintained vast silk reserves as a strategic asset, much as modern governments maintain gold reserves, and it was the primary tool of Chinese diplomacy. The Heikin treaties with the Xiongnu involved enormous annual payments of silk. When China wanted to reward a loyal vassal state, it sent silk. When it wanted to impress a foreign delegation, it displayed silk. The fabric was so central to Chinese economic and political life that the Chinese character for silk became embedded in dozens of other characters related to wealth, trade, and social status. But what made silk so valuable to the outside world was not just its beauty, but its scarcity and mystery. For centuries, the peoples of Central Asia, Persia, India, and eventually Rome had no idea how silk was made. Theories abounded. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, believed that silk was combed from the leaves of trees in a distant eastern land. Other Roman writers speculated that it was spun from the fur of exotic animals or extracted from the bark of rare plants. The Chinese actively encouraged this ignorance, understanding that the mystery surrounding silk's origin was itself a source of value. As long as no one else could make it, China controlled the supply. And controlling the supply of the most desirable luxury good in the known world was a form of power that no army could replicate. It was this combination in Yi's beauty, scarcity, utility, and mystery that made silk the perfect trade good for long-distance commerce. It was lightweight relative to its value, making it economical to transport across vast distances. It was durable enough to survive months of travel without significant degradation. It was universally desired, which meant it could be exchanged at every stop along a trade route, serving as a de facto international currency, and it was produced in quantities large enough to sustain a continuous flow of trade, but not so abundant that it lost its cachet. When Emperor Wu received Zhang Qian's report and grasped the implications of direct westward trade, silk became the centerpiece of a deliberate imperial strategy. The emperor sent a series of follow-up missions to the kingdoms Zhang Qian had described, carrying gifts of silk to establish diplomatic relations. He pushed China's military frontier westward, conquering the Hexi Corridor, the narrow strip of habitable land between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert that served as the gateway between China proper and Central Asia, and establishing the 4 commanderies of Wuwei, Zhangye, Juquan, and Dunhuang. He extended the Great Wall westward to protect this corridor and stationed garrisons at regular intervals along it. And he sent Zhang Qian on a second diplomatic mission, this time to the Wusun people in the Ilai Valley, again seeking alliances but also establishing the formal trade relationships that would define the next 2 millennia of Eurasian exchange. Zhang Qian died around 113 BCE, just a few years after his second mission. He never saw the full flowering of what he had begun. But the routes he had mapped, the contacts he had established, and the intelligence he had gathered formed the foundation of a trade network that would, within a generation, extend Chinese silk into markets that Zhang Qian himself had only heard rumors of. Within a century of his death, Roman senators would be draping their wives in Chinese silk without any clear idea of where it came from. Within 2 centuries, Buddhist monks would be carrying sutras eastward along the same routes that carried silk westward. Within 5 centuries, the network would sustain the largest continuous zone of cultural exchange the world had ever known. But the Silk Road did not spring into existence fully formed the moment Zhang Qian returned to Chang'an. It grew slowly, organically, through the accumulated decisions of thousands of anonymous individuals, your merchants, monks, soldiers, translators, camel drivers, innkeepers, bandits, and diplomats, each of whom added a small segment, a new connection, a piece of local knowledge to the growing web. To understand how the Silk Road actually functioned, we must leave the imperial courts and descend to the level of the ground itself, the physical, material, brutally demanding ground that every trader had to cross. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a merchant in Chang'an in the 1st century BCE. You have acquired a consignment of silk, perhaps a dozen bolts of fine weave, each about 12 meters long, tightly rolled and wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against moisture and dust. You intend to sell it westward, where its value increases with every kilometer of distance from its source. The mathematics of the enterprise are simple. Silk that costs you a modest sum in Chang'an might fetch 10 times that price in Kashgar, 20 times in Samarkand, and perhaps 50 times, if it survives the journey, in the markets of Antioch or Rome. But between you and those distant profits lies a journey of approximately 7,000 kilometers, crossing some of the most hostile terrain on Earth and requiring anywhere from 6 months to 2 years depending on your route, your luck, and whether you survive at all. Your first decision is which route to take. From Chang'an, the road leads northwest through the Hexi corridor toward Dunhuang, the last major Chinese settlement before the desert. This stretch is relatively safe, garrisoned, patrolled, and dotted with rest stations every 40 or 50 kilometers. The real choices begin at Dunhuang. From Dunhuang, you face the Taklamakan. There are 2 routes around it, and the choice between them will shape everything that follows. The northern route skirts the base of the Tian Shan Mountains, passing through the oasis towns of Hami, Turfan, Kucha, and Kashgar. It is longer but better watered, with oases more closely spaced and mountain streams feeding into the desert's edge. The southern route follows the base of the Kunlun Mountains, passing through Miran, Nia, Khotan, and eventually reaching Kashgar from the south. It is shorter in some respects, but more dangerous, with longer stretches between water sources and a more punishing climate. Neither route crosses the Taklamakan directly. No one crosses the Taklamakan directly. The desert is approximately 1,000 kilometers long and 400 wide, and its interior is a shifting landscape of sand dunes that can reach 300 meters in height. There is no water, no vegetation, no shade, and no landmarks. The sand shifts constantly, erasing tracks within hours. Temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius in summer and drop below -20 in winter. Sandstorms called Karaburan Orachi, the Black Hurricanes, can last for days, reducing visibility to zero and burying everything in their path. The Chinese called it the Sea of Death. The Uyghur name, Taklamakan, carries connotations of entering and not returning. The 2 routes around its edges are not alternatives chosen for convenience. They are the only options compatible with human survival. Let us say you choose the northern route. You depart Dunhuang in early spring, when temperatures are moderate and snowmelt from the mountains ensures the oases are at their fullest. Your caravan is not a solo enterprise. You have joined a larger group, perhaps 30 to 50 merchants, each with their own goods, their own animals, their own servants and guards. Collective travel is not optional. A lone merchant in the desert is a dead merchant. The caravan provides security against bandits, shared knowledge of water sources and route conditions, mutual assistance when animals fall sick or loads shift, and the simple psychological comfort of human company in a landscape designed to break the human spirit. Your animals are camels, Bactrian camels, the two-humped variety native to Central Asia. They are not beautiful animals. They are ungainly, ill-tempered, and smell profoundly bad. They are also, without exaggeration, the reason the Silk Road existed at all. A Bactrian camel can carry approximately 200 kilograms of cargo. It can travel 30 to 40 kilometers per day under load. It can go without water for up to 2 weeks in cool weather, surviving on the fat reserves stored in its humps. Its wide padded feet distribute its weight across soft sand without sinking. Its double row of eyelashes and closable nostrils protect it from sandstorms. Its thick wool coat insulates it against both summer heat and winter cold. Without the Bactrian camel, long-distance overland trade across Central Asia would have been physically impossible. Every bolt of silk, every sack of spice, every bar of precious metal that moved along the Silk Road moved on the back of a camel. Your caravan travels in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the midday heat. The rhythm is monotonous but purposeful. Wake before dawn. Load the camels. A skilled camel driver can load a Bactrian in under 15 minutes, but an improperly loaded camel will develop sores that can cripple it within days. Walk. The terrain alternates between hard-packed gravel desert, soft sand that drags at every step, and occasional rocky passes where the route threads between cliff faces. The sound is the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of camel feet on sand, the jingle of harness bells, bells that serve not just as decoration but as a way of keeping the caravan together in poor visibility. The smell is dust, camel, unwashed human bodies, and occasionally the sharp mineral scent of a distant water source carried on the wind. The light is relentless. The sky is a dome of uninterrupted blue so vast and deep that it seems to press down on the landscape with physical weight. At intervals of 3 to 7 days, depending on the season and the route, you reach an oasis. The word oasis conjures images of palm trees and crystal pools, but most Silk Road oases were modest settlements, a cluster of mud brick buildings around a water source, a small area of irrigated agriculture, a caravansary where travelers could stable their animals and sleep under a roof. Some oases were barely more than a well and a few shade trees. Others had grown into substantial towns with markets, temples, and permanent populations of several thousand. But all oases shared one fundamental characteristic: they existed because of water. And water existed because of snowmelt from distant mountains flowing underground through qanats, an ingenious system of gently sloping tunnels that tapped into subterranean water tables and carried the water to the surface through gravity alone, without pumps or any moving parts. The qanat system was one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, and without it, the oasis towns of the Silk Road could not have existed. At each oasis, the caravan rests, resupplies, and conducts business. This is a critical point about the Silk Road that is often misunderstood. Very few merchants traveled its entire length. The image of a single trader carrying silk from Chang'an to Rome is almost entirely fictional. In reality, the Silk Road functioned as a relay system. A Chinese merchant might carry silk from Chang'an to Dunhuang and sell it to a Sogdian trader. The Sogdian would carry it to Kashgar and sell it to a Kushan merchant. The Kushan would carry it to Bactria and sell it to a Parthian middleman. The Parthian would carry it to Ctesiphon or Palmyra and sell it to a Roman dealer. Each transaction added value. Each intermediary took a margin. By the time a bolt of silk reached Rome, its price reflected not just the cost of production, but the accumulated costs of transport risk, customs duties, bribes, and the profits of every hand it had passed through. This relay system meant that the Silk Road was not a corridor but a marketplace, a continuous chain of transactions that enriched every community it touched. The oasis towns along the route did not merely serve as passing caravans. They became centers of commerce in their own right, where goods from east and west accumulated, were sorted, graded, repackaged, and redirected. A merchant in Kashgar might hold inventory from 20 different sources, combining Chinese silk with Indian spices, Central Asian horses, and Mediterranean glassware into new consignments tailored to specific destinations. The oasis towns were the nodes in the network, and their prosperity depended on maintaining their position as indispensable middlemen. The men who dominated this middleman role for nearly 1,000 years were the Sogdians, a people whose name has largely vanished from popular history, but whose influence on the ancient world was immeasurable. The Sogdians came from Sogdiana, a region centered on the fertile valleys of the Zarafshan and Kashkadarya rivers in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Their principal cities were Samarkand and Bukhara, names that still carry a faint shimmer of the exotic, though their modern incarnations bear little resemblance to the thriving commercial centers of the first millennium. The Sogdians were an Iranian people, speaking an Eastern Iranian language and practicing Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion of light and darkness, truth and falsehood. But their defining characteristic was not their ethnicity or their faith, it was their extraordinary aptitude for trade. The Sogdians were the merchant caste of the ancient Silk Road. They established trading colonies, small communities of Sogdian expatriates, at virtually every major stop along the route, from Chang'an in the east to the Black Sea in the west. A network of Sogdian trading posts stretched across the entirety of Central Asia, each one connected to the others by family ties, shared language, and mutual commercial interest. A Sogdian merchant in Dunhuang could write a letter in Sogdian script, hand it to a passing caravan leader, and be confident that it would reach his cousin in Samarkand within a few months, carried from oasis to oasis by fellow Sogdians who treated the mail as part of their communal obligations. We know this because of a remarkable discovery made in 1907 by the British-Hungarian archaeologist Aurel Stein. In a ruined watchtower along the Great Wall near Dunhuang, Stein found a collection of letters written in the Sogdian language, dating to approximately 313 CE. These ancient letters, as they became known, are among the most revealing documents of Silk Road life ever discovered. They include business correspondence between Sogdian merchants, discussing prices, debts, and the logistics of long-distance trade. But they also include personal letters, one from a Sogdian woman named Mune to her husband, who had left her stranded in Dunhuang without funds, complaining bitterly about her situation and the unreliability of other Sogdians she had turned to for help. The letters pulse with life, frustration, and the mundane anxieties of people trying to conduct business across impossible distances. They remind us that the Silk Road was not an abstraction. It was a network of real human beings with real families, real debts, and real grievances. The Sogdian dominance of Silk Road trade was not accidental. It arose from a combination of geographic advantage. Sogdiana sat at the crossroads of the major east-west and north-south routes, and cultural adaptation. Sogdian merchants were multilingual, often speaking Sogdian, Chinese, Turkic, and sometimes Sanskrit or Arabic. They were religiously flexible, maintaining their Zoroastrian identity while adapting to the spiritual expectations of whatever community they lived in. Some Sogdians in China adopted Buddhist names, and later Sogdians would be among the earliest Central Asian converts to Islam. They were skilled at navigating the complex web of political relationships that determined safe passage along the routes, maintaining good relations with whatever power controlled a given stretch of territory at any given time. And they were, by all accounts, extremely good at the actual mechanics of trade, assessing quality, negotiating prices, managing risk, and maintaining the long-distance trust relationships that made the entire system function. The Sogdian trading network was, in many ways, the circulatory system of the Silk Road. Goods flowed along its channels. Information traveled through its connections. Languages, religious ideas, artistic styles, and technological innovations all moved through the Sogdian mercantile web. When a new product or idea appeared at one end of the Silk Road, it was often Sogdian merchants who recognized its value, facilitated its movement, and profited from its sale. They were not the only traders on the Silk Road. Jewish merchants, Indian traders, Armenian middlemen, and Arab dealers all played significant roles. But for the better part of a millennium, from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 8th century CE, the Sogdians were the dominant commercial force in overland Eurasian trade. Their prosperity and the prosperity of the entire Silk Road system depended on one thing above all others: the maintenance of political stability along the routes. Trade requires predictability. A merchant who invests his life savings in a consignment of silk needs to know with reasonable confidence that the route ahead is passable, that the customs officials at the next border will accept a bribe rather than confiscate his goods, that the garrison at the next oasis will protect him rather than rob him, and that the political situation at his destination has not changed so drastically during his 6-month journey that his goods are now worthless or his person is now endangered. When empires were strong and borders were stable, trade flourished. When empires collapsed and borders dissolved into chaos, trade withered. This dynamic, the intimate connection between political power and commercial exchange, is the thread that runs through the entire 2,000-year history of the Silk Road. And to follow that thread, we must now trace the empires that one by one rose and fell along the great transcontinental routes, shaping the flow of goods, ideas, and people like a series of dams and channels directing the course of a river. In the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, and the western sections of what would become the Silk Road were dominated by 2 great powers, the Parthian Empire and the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms. The Parthians were an Iranian dynasty who had seized control of the former Seleucid territories, the eastern remnants of Alexander the Great's empire, in the mid-3rd century BCE. At their height, the Parthians controlled a vast stretch of territory from the Euphrates River in the west to the borders of modern Afghanistan in the east. Their capital at Ctesiphon, on the Tigris River near modern Baghdad, sat at the junction of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world with Central Asia and India. The Parthians were not, by nature, a mercantile people. They were horse archers, steppe warriors who had settled into the rhythms of empire without entirely losing their nomadic edge. But they understood the value of controlling trade routes, and they positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries between Roman demand for Eastern luxuries and Chinese supply. The Parthian approach to Silk Road trade was essentially extractive. They did not produce silk themselves, but they controlled the territory through which silk had to pass on its way from Central Asia to the Roman frontier. They charged customs duties at their borders, taxed goods in transit through their territory, and maintained a monopoly on the sale of Eastern goods to Roman merchants at frontier trading posts. They were also strategic about information. The Parthians had no interest in allowing direct contact between Rome and China, because such contact would eliminate the need for Parthian intermediaries. When Chinese envoys reached Parthian territory, as they did following Zhang Qian's reports, the Parthians received them courteously but ensured that they never passed through to the Roman Empire. When Roman merchants inquired about the source of silk, the Parthians offered vague or misleading answers. The fog of ignorance that surrounded silk's origins in the Roman world was not accidental. It was, at least in part, deliberately maintained by the Parthians as a commercial strategy. To the east of Parthia, in what is now Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, lay the territories that had been conquered by the Yuezhi, the same people Zhang Qian had sought on behalf of Emperor Wu. By the 1st century CE, the Yuezhi had consolidated their power into what historians call the Kushan Empire, on one of the most important and least remembered polities in world history. The Kushans controlled a territory that straddled the critical junction where the Silk Road's east-west routes intersected with the north-south routes connecting Central Asia to the Indian subcontinent. Their kingdom encompassed modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and large portions of northern India and Central Asia. Their capital, Peshawar, and their great city of Bactria sat at the crossroads of the ancient world. The Kushans were remarkable for their cultural eclecticism. Their coins, which survive in large numbers, display an extraordinary range of religious imagery. Greek gods, Iranian deities, Hindu figures, and Buddhist symbols all appear on Kushan coinage, sometimes on the same coin. This was not confused syncretism, but deliberate political strategy. The Kushan emperors ruled over a population that included Greeks, Indians, Iranians, Central Asian nomads, and numerous smaller ethnic groups, each with their own religious traditions. By honoring all of them, the Kushans maintained the diverse coalition that held their empire together. But the Kushans' most consequential contribution to world history was their role in the spread of Buddhism. Under the patronage of Kushan emperors, most notably Kanishka the Great, who ruled in the early 2nd century CE, Buddhism underwent a transformation from a primarily Indian religious tradition into a world religion. Kushan patronage funded the construction of monasteries and stupas along the Silk Road trade routes. Kushan artists, blending Greek sculptural techniques with Buddhist iconography, he created the first representations of the Buddha in human form, the Gandharan style, named after the region of Gandhara in northern Pakistan, where Greek and Indian artistic traditions fused into something entirely new. And Kushan trade networks provided the physical infrastructure, the roads, the caravanserais, the oasis towns, along which Buddhist monks traveled eastward into Central Asia and eventually into China. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road is one of the most profound examples of a phenomenon that defined the entire network, the movement of ideas alongside goods. No one planned it. No emperor decreed it. No missionary organization coordinated it. Buddhist monks simply traveled the same routes as merchants, for the same practical reasons. Safety in numbers, access to food and shelter, are the protection of caravan routes maintained by powerful states. They stopped at the same oasis towns, rested in the same caravanserais, and shared the same campfires. And at those campfires, in those moments of rest between one day's march and the next, conversations happened. Stories were told, questions were asked, ideas moved. The arrival of Buddhism in China is not a single event, but a gradual process that unfolded over centuries, and its history is inseparable from the history of the Silk Road itself. The earliest evidence of Buddhist presence in China dates to the 1st century CE, roughly 2 centuries after Zhang Qian's journey, when Buddhist monks and texts began appearing in the Chinese capital, carried by merchants and missionaries who had traveled the overland routes from Central Asia. The initial Chinese reaction to Buddhism was puzzlement. Chinese civilization possessed 2 deeply rooted intellectual traditions: Confucianism, which emphasized social order, filial piety, and the proper conduct of relationships, and Taoism, which emphasized harmony with the natural world and the cultivation of inner stillness. Buddhism, with its doctrine of suffering, its emphasis on renunciation and monasticism, and its complex metaphysical framework of reincarnation and karma, did not fit neatly into either tradition. The concept of monasticism was particularly foreign to Seymour. The idea that a man should leave his family, shave his head, and beg for food was deeply offensive to Confucian values, which held family obligations as the foundation of all morality. Yet Buddhism possessed qualities that resonated with Chinese spiritual needs in ways that Confucianism and Taoism did not fully address. It offered a comprehensive explanation of suffering, why it existed, what caused it, and how it could be transcended. It provided detailed meditation practices that overlapped with and enriched Taoist contemplative traditions. Its sophisticated philosophical framework appealed to intellectuals who found Confucian pragmatism spiritually unsatisfying, and its promise of personal salvation, the possibility that any individual, regardless of social status, could achieve enlightenment, had a democratic appeal that resonated with people living in an era of political instability and social upheaval. The process of Buddhist translation and adaptation in China was itself a Silk Road phenomenon. The earliest Buddhist texts in Chinese were translated by Central Asian monks, Parthians, Sogdians, Kushans, and Indians, working with Chinese collaborators who helped them navigate the nuances of the Chinese language. The most famous of these early translators was An Shigao, a Parthian prince who arrived in the Chinese capital of Luoyang around 148 CE and spent the next 2 decades translating Buddhist texts into Chinese. His name itself tells a story. An was the Chinese surname assigned to people from the Arsacid Parthian territory, and Shigao was a Chinese rendering of a Parthian royal title. He was, in his own person, a living embodiment of Silk Road cultural exchange. A Parthian nobleman who became a Buddhist monk, traveled to China, learned Chinese, and spent his life making Indian religious texts accessible to Chinese readers. The physical spaces of Buddhist transmission along the Silk Road remain some of the most haunting archaeological sites in the world. At Dunhuang, the last major oasis before the desert, travelers carved hundreds of caves into the sandstone cliffs and filled them with paintings, images of the Buddha, of bodhisattvas, of celestial musicians and flying apsaras, of donor portraits showing the wealthy merchants and officials who funded the cave's creation. The Mogao Caves at Dunhuang, begun in the 4th century CE and continuously expanded for nearly 1,000 years, contain over 45,000 square meters of wall paintings and more than 2,000 painted sculptures. They are a visual encyclopedia of Silk Road culture, showing not just Buddhist iconography but the faces, the clothing, the musical instruments, and the daily life of the people who pass through this remote outpost at the edge of the desert. Further west, at Bamiyan in modern Afghanistan, 2 colossal Buddha statues, one 38 meters tall, the other 55 meters, were carved into the cliff face in the 6th century CE, visible to travelers from kilometers away. They stood for 1,500 years, silent witnesses to the passage of caravans, armies, pilgrims, and empires before the Taliban destroyed them in 2001. An act of cultural violence that, in its own grim way, testified to the enduring power of the religious ideas that the Silk Road had carried. At Bezeklik, near Turfan, in the Taklamakan's northern rim, caves painted between the 5th and 14th centuries show a stunning diversity of artistic influences: Chinese, Indian, Persian, Turkic, and Hellenistic traditions all visible in a single site. The faces in the paintings are not uniform. Some are clearly Central Asian with prominent noses and deep-set eyes. Others are Chinese. Others show features suggesting Indian or even Mediterranean ancestry. The caves at Bezeklik are a portrait gallery of the Silk Road's human diversity, frozen in pigment on stone walls. These cave complexes were not merely religious sites, they were also libraries, schools, and cultural archives. The library cave at Dunhuang, Cave 17, sealed sometime in the 11th century and rediscovered in 1900, contained approximately 50,000 documents in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, Uyghur, Hebrew, and other languages. The collection included Buddhist sutras, Taoist texts, Confucian classics, administrative documents, contracts, calendars, dictionaries, medical texts, mathematical treatises, and the world's oldest dated printed book, a Chinese translation of the Diamond Sutra printed using woodblock technology in 868 CE. This single cave contained more information about the medieval Silk Road than all other sources combined. Its discovery was one of the most significant archaeological events of the 20th century, and the dispersal of its contents, divided among British, French, Russian, Japanese, and Chinese collections, remains a source of scholarly controversy to this day. While Buddhism traveled eastward along the Silk Road, other goods and ideas traveled in both directions, creating a network of exchange so complex that no single commodity or belief system can be said to define it. Silk moved west. But what moved east? The answer is nearly everything. From Central Asia came the horses that Emperor Wu had coveted, the heavenly horses of Fergana that the Chinese believed could carry a rider into immortality. Horses were strategic goods, not luxuries. The Chinese military's chronic disadvantage against steppe nomads stemmed largely from the inferior quality of its horse stock, and the acquisition of superior Central Asian breeds was a matter of national security. Emperor Wu launched 2 military expeditions against Fergana, in 104 and 102 BCE, for the explicit purpose of capturing breeding stock. The second expedition, involving a force of perhaps 60,000 men crossing the Taklamakan Desert to lay siege to the Fergana capital, was one of the most logistically ambitious military operations of the ancient world. It succeeded. The captured horses were paraded through Chang'an to public celebration. For centuries afterward, Chinese poets and painters celebrated the blood-sweating horses of the West, and the importation of fine horses remained one of the Silk Road's most important functions. From the Roman world came glassware, another product whose manufacture was a closely guarded secret, just as silk production was in China. Roman glass, transparent or colored, blown into shapes of astonishing delicacy, was as mysterious and desirable to Chinese consumers as silk was to Roman ones. Fragments of Roman glass have been found in Han Dynasty tombs, placed alongside the dead as luxury goods fit for the afterlife. The glass trade was smaller in volume than the silk trade, but it illustrates the reciprocal nature of Silk Road exchange. Each civilization possessed a material technology that the other could not replicate, and the desire for these complementary luxuries drove trade in both directions. From India came spices, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, whose value in the ancient world is difficult for modern consumers, accustomed to supermarkets where spices cost a few dollars per jar, to fully appreciate. In an age before refrigeration, spices served multiple functions. They preserved food, masking the taste of meat that had begun to turn. They served as medicines. Many spices have genuine antiseptic, analgesic, or digestive properties. They were used in religious rituals, burned as incense in temples from India to Rome, and they were markers of wealth and sophistication. Were their presence at a dinner table signaling the host's access to distant trade networks and the resources to exploit them? Pepper, in particular, was so valuable in the Roman world that it was sometimes used as a form of currency. The Visigoths, when they sacked Rome in 410 CE, demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper as part of the ransom. From Persia came metalwork. Silver vessels, gold ornaments, and objects of wrought iron that displayed a technical mastery admired throughout the ancient world. Persian metalworking traditions, blending Mesopotamian, Greek, and steppe nomadic influences, produced objects of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. A silver plate from Sassanid Persia might depict a royal hunt with a level of anatomical precision and compositional complexity that rivals anything produced in the contemporary Roman world. These objects traveled the Silk Road not just as trade goods, but as diplomatic gifts. The exchange of luxury metalwork between courts was a fundamental element of ancient diplomacy, and from everywhere came precious stones. Jade, prized above all other materials in Chinese culture, flowed from the mines of Khotan on the Silk Road's southern route into China, where it was carved into ritual objects, jewelry, and burial goods. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone valued since Sumerian times, traveled from its primary source in the mountains of Badakhshan in northeastern Afghanistan to markets in China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Rubies from Burma, sapphires from Sri Lanka, turquoise from Iran, carnelian from India. Each stone had its own network of extraction, processing, and trade that fed into the Silk Road's larger web. The cumulative effect of this multi-directional exchange was a world that was, despite the vast distances and difficult terrain, surprisingly interconnected. A wealthy Roman matron in the 1st century CE might wear Chinese silk, Indian pearls, and Baltic amber. Her dinner table might feature pepper from Malabar, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, and wine served in glass vessels that would be admired as far away as Korea. A Chinese nobleman of the same period might drink wine from grapes. A plant introduced from the West is served in a Persian-style silver cup, while listening to music played on instruments whose design originated in Central Asia. Neither the Roman nor the Chinese nobleman would have had any clear conception of the other's civilization. They were connected not by knowledge, but by desire. The universal human desire for the beautiful, the rare, and the distant. By the 1st century CE, the Silk Road had matured into a functioning transcontinental network, and at its western terminus, it encountered the largest market in the world, Rome. The Roman appetite for silk was insatiable, and from the perspective of Roman moralists, deeply troubling. Silk arrived in Rome primarily through 2 channels. The overland route brought silk from Central Asia through Parthian territory to frontier trading posts on the Euphrates, where Roman merchants purchased it for distribution throughout the empire. The maritime route brought silk and other eastern goods by sea from India to the Red Sea ports of Egypt, particularly the port of Berenice, from which they were transported overland to the Nile and then downriver to Alexandria, the greatest commercial hub in the Mediterranean world. The quantities involved were staggering. Pliny the Elder, writing around 77 CE, estimated that Rome's trade deficit with the East, the excess of gold and silver flowing out of the empire to pay for silk, spices, and other luxuries, amounted to 100 million sesterces annually. This figure is debated by modern scholars, some of whom consider it an exaggeration, and others who believe it may actually understate the scale of the drain. And what is not debated is the direction of the flow. Roman precious metals poured eastward along the Silk Road in exchange for goods that, however beautiful, were consumed or worn out within a few years. The trade was, from a strictly economic perspective, unsustainable. Rome was slowly bleeding wealth into the sands of Asia. This fact was not lost on Roman commentators. Seneca the Younger complained that Roman women wore silk garments so sheer that they concealed nothing, and that this extravagance was undermining the moral fabric of society along with the financial one. Pliny himself railed against the silk trade as a drain on the treasury, noting with evident disgust that Roman women's vanity was enriching distant barbarians at the empire's expense. The Emperor Tiberius attempted to ban men from wearing silk, apparently on grounds of both morality and economics. The ban, like most sumptuary legislation in history, was ignored. The Roman fascination with silk was not purely aesthetic. Silk had practical military applications. It was sometimes used as an underlayer beneath armor, since its smooth fibers tended to wrap around an arrow point rather than being penetrated by it, making arrow extraction easier. It was used in medical settings for sutures and bandages, and it served, as it did everywhere, as a marker of status and power. A Roman senator who appeared in silk was making a statement about his wealth, his connections, and his willingness to spend extravagantly on personal display. But the most consequential aspect of Roman engagement with the Silk Road was not the silk trade itself, but the cultural and intellectual exchange that accompanied it. Roman awareness of China, which they called Serica, the land of silk, was vague but real. Chinese awareness of Rome, which they called Daqin, the Great Qin, was equally imprecise but acknowledged the existence of a powerful Western empire. In 97 CE, the Chinese general Ban Chao, who had extended Han military power deep into Central Asia, sent an envoy named Gan Ying westward with instructions to reach Daqin and establish direct contact. Gan Ying traveled as far as the Persian Gulf from Rome, closer to Rome than any Chinese official had ever been, before Parthian sailors apparently discouraged him from continuing, warning of dangerous seas and a voyage that might take 2 years. Whether the Parthians' warnings were genuine or a deliberate attempt to prevent direct Sino-Roman contact that would bypass Parthian intermediaries is a question scholars have debated for centuries. Direct contact between Rome and China remained tantalizingly elusive for most of the classical period. Chinese sources record that in 166 CE, a group claiming to be envoys from the Roman Emperor Endun, likely Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, arrived at the Han court by sea, having traveled via Southeast Asia. They brought gifts of ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoise-shell, luxury goods that any merchant traveling from the Roman East might carry, but not exactly the kind of rare treasures that an emperor would send to another emperor. Modern scholars generally believe that these were Roman merchants posing as imperial envoys to gain preferential treatment at the Chinese court. If so, it was a creative piece of commercial fraud that inadvertently created the first recorded contact between the two greatest civilizations of the classical world. The stability that sustained the Silk Road's first great flourishing depended on the health of the empires that guarded its roots. The Han dynasty in the east, the Kushan Empire at the crossroads, the Parthian Empire in the middle, and the Roman Empire in the west, and these four powers spanning the breadth of Eurasia provided the security, the infrastructure, and the demand that kept the caravans moving. When they were strong, the Silk Road prospered. When they weakened, the Silk Road contracted. And by the 3rd century CE, all four were in trouble. The Han Dynasty fell in 220 CE, fragmenting China into the three kingdoms and inaugurating nearly 4 centuries of political division and civil war. The Kushan Empire declined in the 3rd century, its territories absorbed by the Sassanid Persians from the west and various Central Asian powers from the north. The Parthian Empire was overthrown by the Sassanid dynasty in 224 CE, a revolution that replaced one Iranian empire with another, but disrupted existing trade relationships and political arrangements. And the Roman Empire entered the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of civil war, economic collapse, barbarian invasion, and plague that nearly destroyed it. The 3rd century crisis did not kill the Silk Road. Trade routes are resilient. They may contract, they may shift, they may thin to a trickle, but as long as there is desire on one end and supply on the other, they do not die. What the 3rd century crisis did was transform the Silk Road from a network sustained by great empires into a network sustained by smaller, more local powers, city-states, tribal confederacies, and regional kingdoms that controlled individual segments of the route without commanding the whole. Trade continued, but it was slower, more fragmented, more dependent on local protection, and more vulnerable to disruption. The recovery, when it came from an unexpected direction. The Sassanid Empire, which replaced the Parthians as the dominant power in Western and Central Asia, proved to be one of the most consequential forces in Silk Road history. When the Sassanids ruled from 224 to 651 CE, over 4 centuries of continuous sovereignty that provided the stable political framework within which Western Silk Road trade could revive and flourish. The Sassanids were consciously imperial in a way that the Parthians had never quite been. They claimed descent from the Achaemenid Persians, the dynasty of Cyrus and Darius that had built the first great Persian empire over 1,000 years earlier in Imao. And they set about recreating that empire's grandeur with systematic determination. Their capital at Ctesiphon was one of the great cities of the ancient world, centered on the Tak Khasra, the Arch of Ctesiphon, whose massive brick vault, 37 meters high and 26 meters across, remained the largest unreinforced brick arch in the world for over a millennium. Their court was a center of artistic and intellectual patronage that drew scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the known world. Their religion, Zoroastrianism, received state sponsorship and institutional support, with a formal priestly hierarchy and a network of fire temples that served as both religious centers and symbols of imperial authority. The Sassanid approach to Silk Road trade was more sophisticated than the Parthian one. The Sassanids did not merely tax goods in transit, they actively participated in manufacturing and export. Sassanid silk workshops, established after smuggled silkworm eggs finally broke China's monopoly on silk production sometime in the 5th or 6th century CE, produced distinctive Persian silk fabrics that competed with Chinese silk in markets throughout the ancient world. Sassanid silverwork, renowned for its beauty and technical excellence, was exported along the Silk Road in both directions, reaching China in the east and Byzantium in the west. Sassanid glass, Sassanid metalwork, and Sassanid textiles all entered the Silk Road trading system, transforming the Sassanid Empire from a mere middleman into a productive participant in transcontinental exchange. The Sassanids also served as transmitters of knowledge. The Great Academy of Gandhishapur, founded in the 3rd century CE in southwestern Iran, became one of the ancient world's premier centers of learning, attracting scholars from Greece, India, and Syria. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the Academy of Athens in 529 CE, the last surviving school of Greek philosophy, several of its scholars found refuge at Gandhishapur, bringing with them Greek philosophical and scientific texts that were translated into Syriac and Persian. These texts would later be translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, preserving the works of Aristotle, Plato, Hippocrates, and Galen for posterity. The chain of transmission ran directly along the Silk Road. Greek knowledge to Sassanid Persian preservation, to Arabic translation to eventual retransmission to medieval Europe. Without the Sassanid Empire's role as a cultural intermediary, a significant portion of the Western intellectual heritage might have been permanently lost. While the Sassanids reshaped the Western Silk Road, the eastern sections underwent their own transformation during the centuries of Chinese political fragmentation following the Han Dynasty's fall. The period from 220 to 589 CE, encompassing the three kingdoms, the Jin dynasty, the 16 kingdoms, and the southern and northern dynasties, was one of the most turbulent in Chinese history. Civil wars, barbarian invasions from the northern steppe, and mass population movements southward tore the old Han order apart. But the Silk Road did not cease to function. In many ways, it became more important, not less, precisely because political fragmentation increased the demand for the goods and connections it provided. The northern Chinese states that emerged from the post-Han chaos were often ruled by non-Chinese dynasties, Xiongnu, Xianbei, Di, Qiang, and other steppe peoples who had conquered portions of northern China and established their own kingdoms. These rulers had deep connections to the Central Asian world from which they had come, and they maintained and even expanded trade relationships along the Silk Road. The Northern Wei dynasty, established by the Yanbei Tuoba clan in 386 CE, was particularly significant. The Northern Wei controlled the eastern terminus of the Silk Road and actively encouraged trade, establishing markets in their capital at Datong and later Luoyang, where foreign merchants congregated in numbers that Chinese sources describe with a mixture of fascination and anxiety. The Northern Wei are also responsible for one of the Silk Road's greatest cultural monuments, the Yungang Grottos, carved into a sandstone cliff face near Datong between approximately 460 and 525 CE. The grottos contain over 51,000 Buddhist statues, ranging from tiny figures a few centimeters high to a colossal seated Buddha over 13 meters tall. The artistic style of the Yungang carving shows a remarkable fusion of influences: Indian Buddhist iconography, Central Asian sculptural techniques, Chinese aesthetic sensibilities, and traces of Greco-Bactrian artistic tradition, all visible in a single site. The grottos are a testament to the cultural mixing that the Silk Road made possible, and their creation was funded in part by the profits of Silk Road trade flowing through the Northern Wei capital. Buddhism, which had entered China as a foreign curiosity during the Han Dynasty, exploded in popularity during the period of disunion. When the political chaos and social upheaval of the age created a spiritual vacuum that neither Confucianism, with its emphasis on social stability and proper governance, both of which had manifestly failed, nor Taoism, with its emphasis on withdrawal from the world, could adequately fill. Buddhism's promise of salvation beyond the suffering of the present world resonated powerfully with populations living through decades of war, plague, and famine. The construction of temples, monasteries, and cave complexes along the Silk Road accelerated dramatically. Monks traveled back and forth between China and India with increasing frequency, carrying texts, ideas, and artistic traditions that enriched both civilizations. The most famous of these pilgrim monks was Faxian, and who departed Chang'an in 399 CE on a journey to India to obtain authentic Buddhist texts. He was approximately 60 years old when he set out, an age that in the 5th century qualified a man as elderly. He traveled overland along the Silk Road's southern route, crossing the Taklamakan and the Pamir Mountains, descending into the Gandharan kingdoms of northwestern India, and eventually reaching the sacred sites of Buddhism in the Gangetic Plain. He spent years in India studying, copying texts, and visiting monasteries before returning to China by sea, a voyage that took him through Sri Lanka, across the Indian Ocean, and through the straits of Southeast Asia. His account of his journey, The Record of Buddhist Kingdoms, is one of the most detailed descriptions of the Silk Road and Indian civilization from this period, And its observations about the Buddhist monasteries, trade routes, and local customs of 5th century Central and South Asia remain invaluable to historians. Faxian's journey illustrates a point about the Silk Road that bears emphasizing. It was not merely a commercial network, it was a network of human purpose, and the purposes that drove people along it were as various as the people themselves. Merchants traveled it seeking profit. Soldiers traveled it seeking conquest. Diplomats traveled it seeking alliances, and monks traveled it seeking truth. The goods they carried, silk, spices, glass, jade, were the visible surface of a deeper exchange, one measured not in bolts and bushels but in ideas, beliefs, and ways of understanding the world. The reunification of China under the Sui dynasty in 589 CE and the subsequent rise of the Tang dynasty in 618 CE inaugurated what many historians consider the golden age of the Silk Road. The Tang dynasty presided over one of the most cosmopolitan, culturally vibrant, and commercially active civilizations in human history, and the Silk Road was its lifeline to the wider world. Tang Chang'an, the capital rebuilt and expanded from the old Han capital, was the largest city on Earth with a population that may have reached 2 million at its peak. Its layout was a grid of broad avenues and walled residential wards, centered on the Imperial Palace complex at the north end and the great markets at its heart. The city had 2 principal market areas, the West Market and the East Market, each occupying a space of roughly 1 square kilometer, filled with shops, warehouses, restaurants, entertainment venues, and the offices of merchant guilds from across the known world. The West Market was the Silk Road's eastern terminus, and it was one of the most remarkable commercial spaces in human history. Walking through its streets, a visitor would encounter Sogdian wine merchants selling Central Asian vintages from ceramic jars, Persian jewelers displaying lapis lazuli, turquoise, and rock crystal, Indian monks selling incense and devotional objects, Turkic horse dealers with strings of Central Asian mounts, Malay traders offering spices and aromatic woods from Southeast Asia, Japanese Buddhist pilgrims purchasing sutras and devotional objects to carry home, Arab merchants, a new presence in the 8th century, trading in frankincense, myrrh, and the fine steel of Damascus, and everywhere the local Chinese merchants, to shopkeepers and artisans who formed the market's commercial backbone. The sounds of the West Market would have been a cacophony of languages: Chinese, Sogdian, Turkic, Persian, Sanskrit, Arabic, Tibetan, Korean, and others, all competing for attention in the dusty air of a city that prided itself on welcoming the world. The smells would have been equally complex: roasting meat, incense, horse manure, the sharp tang of fermented mare's milk sold by Central Asian vendors, the sweet heaviness of Persian rosewater, the clean mineral scent of jade being polished in a craftsman's workshop. It was, in every sensory dimension, a microcosm of the Silk Road itself, a place where the world's diversity was compressed into a single marketplace, where the boundaries between civilizations dissolved in the universal solvent of commerce. Tang cosmopolitanism was not merely commercial, it penetrated every dimension of Chinese cultural life. Tang poetry, the supreme artistic achievement of the dynasty and one of the glories of world literature, is shot through with Silk Road imagery. Li Bai, the greatest of the Tang poets, may himself have been born in Central Asia. His birthplace is debated, but several scholars place it in the Suyab region of modern Kyrgyzstan, along the Silk Road's northern route. His poetry speaks of frontier garrisons, distant campaigns, the loneliness of soldiers on the western borders, and the beauty of moonlight on desert sands. Other Tang poets wrote of Central Asian wine, Western dancing girls, exotic musical instruments, and the bittersweet romance of departure along roads that led to the ends of the earth. And Tang music was transformed by Silk Road influence. Central Asian instruments, the pipa, a 4-stringed lute derived from Persian and Central Asian prototypes, the konghu, a harp with Near Eastern origins, and various drums, flutes, and reed instruments became standard features of Chinese musical life. Tang court music incorporated 10 different orchestral traditions, several of them explicitly identified as Central Asian or Indian in origin. The most popular entertainment in Tang China was the whirling dance, a Central Asian performance style featuring rapid spinning movements that required years of training and extraordinary physical conditioning. Central Asian dancers were celebrities in Tang Chang'an, their performances attended by emperors and commoners alike. Our Tang religious life reflected the Silk Road's spiritual diversity with remarkable openness. Buddhism was the dominant imported religion, but it was far from the only one. Zoroastrianism maintained temples in Chang'an and other Chinese cities served primarily by the Sogdian and Persian communities. Manichaeism, a syncretic religion founded by the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, blending elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, attracted a significant Chinese following. Nestorian Christianity, brought by Syrian missionaries who traveled the Silk Road eastward, established a church in Chang'an in 635 CE, and its presence was commemorated by the Nestorian stele, a limestone monument erected in 781 CE that describes the arrival of Christianity in China in both Chinese and Syriac script. The stele, rediscovered by Jesuit missionaries in 1625, remains one of the most remarkable archaeological artifacts of Silk Road religious exchange. Even Judaism and early Islam left traces in Tang China. Jewish merchants from Persia and Central Asia established small communities along the Silk Road, some of which persisted for centuries. Arab and Persian Muslim traders appeared in Chinese ports and markets from the 7th century onward, and Tang records mention mosques in Canton, modern Guangzhou, and other coastal cities. The Tang dynasty's willingness to tolerate this religious diversity was not unlimited. Periodic persecutions of Buddhism and other foreign religions occurred, most notably the great anti-Buddhist persecution of 845 CE. But by the standards of the ancient and medieval world, Tang China's religious openness was exceptional. E.C. The cultural exchange of the Tang period was facilitated by a figure who deserves to stand alongside Zhang Qian in the pantheon of Silk Road history, the Buddhist monk Xuanzang, whose journey to India and back between 629 and 645 CE is one of the greatest travel narratives in human history. Xuanzang was born in 602 CE into a scholarly Chinese family in Henan province. He entered monastic life as a child, ordained as a novice at the age of 13, and quickly established himself as one of the most brilliant Buddhist scholars of his generation. But Xuanzang was troubled by contradictions he found in the Buddhist texts available in Chinese translation. Different translations of the same sutras disagreed on fundamental doctrinal points, and Xuanzang became convinced that only by traveling to India, the source of Buddhist teaching, and studying the original Sanskrit texts could these contradictions be resolved. In 629 CE, Xuanzang applied to the Tang Emperor Taizong for permission to travel to India. The emperor refused. China's western border was unsettled, and allowing a prominent monk to wander into Central Asia presented both security risks and diplomatic complications. Xuanzang went anyway, slipping out of Chang'an under cover of darkness and heading west into the desert alone. His journey took him along the northern Silk Road route, through the oasis kingdoms of the Taklamakan, across the Tian Shan Mountains into the territory of the Western Turkic Khaganate, through the Fergana Valley and Samarkand, across the Hindu Kush into what is now Afghanistan, and finally into the Indian subcontinent. He spent approximately 14 years in India studying at the great Buddhist University of Nalanda, the ancient world's foremost center of Buddhist learning located in modern Bihar, and visiting Buddhist holy sites from Gandhara to Sri Lanka. He debated with scholars, mastered multiple schools of Buddhist philosophy, and collected hundreds of Sanskrit manuscripts and Buddhist relics for transport back to China. Xuanzang's account of his journey, the Great Tang Records on the Western regions, is one of the most detailed and reliable descriptions of the medieval Silk Road and Indian subcontinent in existence. His observations about the cities, kingdoms, religions, and peoples he encountered have been confirmed by archaeological evidence to a remarkable degree. When 19th century European archaeologists went looking for the great Buddhist monastery of Nalanda, it was Xuanzang's description that guided them to the correct site. When scholars sought to reconstruct the political geography of 7th century Central Asia, Xuanzang's account provided the most detailed map available. But Xuanzang's significance extends beyond his value as a historical source. His journey became the basis for one of the great works of Chinese literature, the 16th century novel Journey to the West, attributed to Wu Chengen, which transformed Xuanzang's historical pilgrimage into a fantastical adventure featuring the immortal Monkey King, a cast of gods and demons, and 81 trials that the pilgrims must overcome before reaching the Buddhist scriptures in India. The novel is one of the most beloved works in the Chinese literary tradition, read by children and scholars alike for nearly 500 years. Through Journey to the West, Xuanzang's Silk Road pilgrimage entered the permanent fabric of Chinese cultural memory, ensuring that the Silk Road's legacy would be preserved not just in historical texts, but in the popular imagination. Upon his return to Chang'an in 645 CE, Xuanzang was received by Emperor Taizong, the same emperor who had forbidden his departure 16 years earlier, with extraordinary honors. The emperor, recognizing that Xuanzang's journey had brought China both spiritual wealth and political intelligence, provided imperial patronage for the translation of the Sanskrit texts Xuanzang had brought back. Xuanzang spent the remaining 19 years of his life in Chang'an, leading a team of scholars that translated 74 Buddhist works into Chinese, a body of translation that remains foundational to Chinese Buddhism to this day. The Tang dynasty's golden age of Silk Road exchange did not last. The event that marked its decline was sudden, catastrophic, and originated not in the deserts of Central Asia but in the court politics of Chang'an itself. In 755 CE, a general named An Lushan, himself a product of the Silk Road's multicultural world, of mixed Sogdian and Turkic ancestry on Kairos, launched a rebellion against the Tang Emperor Xuanzang that nearly destroyed the dynasty. The An Lushan rebellion lasted 8 years, killed millions, devastated northern China's cities and countryside, and permanently weakened the Tang state's ability to project power westward along the Silk Road. The rebellion's causes were complex, rooted in tensions between the central government and provincial military commanders, but its consequences for the Silk Road were clear and devastating. Before the rebellion, the Tang dynasty had maintained military garrisons in Central Asia, projecting Chinese power deep into the Silk Road's middle sections. The most significant check on that power had come in 751 CE at the Battle of Talas, fought in modern-day Kazakhstan between Tang forces and an Abbasid Arab army, which ended in a Chinese defeat that marked the western limit of Tang expansion. The battle itself was relatively minor in military terms, but it was symbolically important. It marked the point at which the Islamic world and the Chinese world came into direct military contact. And it established the approximate boundary between the two civilization zones of influence in Central Asia. The An Lushan rebellion forced the Tang to withdraw its Central Asian garrisons to fight the rebels at home. Those garrisons never returned. The power vacuum they left was filled by the Tibetan Empire, which seized control of the Hexi corridor and cut Chang'an off from the western trade routes for several decades. When Tang control was eventually reasserted, it was weaker and more tenuous than before. The great cosmopolitan openness of the early Tang gradually gave way to a more inward-looking, more suspicious attitude toward foreign influences. The great anti-Buddhist persecution of 845 CE, in which thousands of monasteries were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns were forced to return to secular life, all was symptomatic of this shift. Buddhism was targeted not just as a drain on the economy. Monasteries were tax-exempt, and their land holdings had grown enormous, but as a foreign religion that had corrupted Chinese culture. The Tang dynasty limped on until 907 CE, when it finally collapsed into another period of fragmentation, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. The Silk Road's overland routes did not die with the Tang, but they never again achieved the same level of activity under Chinese patronage. The center of gravity in East Asian trade was shifting southward toward the maritime routes that connected China's southern coast with Southeast Asia, India, and the Persian Gulf. The age of sail had not yet arrived, but its foundations were being laid in the harbors of Canton, Quanzhou, and Hangzhou, where Chinese junks, flat-bottomed, multi-masted vessels of remarkable seaworthiness, were beginning to carry the cargoes that had once moved on camelback. While the Tang dynasty's relationship with the Silk Road waned, a new force was reshaping the western and central sections of the network with extraordinary speed: Islam. The Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries transformed the political, cultural, and commercial landscape of the Silk Road more thoroughly than any single event since Zhang Qian's journey. In the space of roughly a century, from the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE to the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 CE, Arab armies conquered the Sassanid Empire in its entirety, seized the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire, and extended Islamic political authority from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the borders of China and India. The Silk Road's western and central sections, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, were, for the first time in history, unified under a single political and religious authority. The impact on trade was transformative. The fragmented political landscape of the post-Sassanid, post-Roman Western Silk Road, with its multiple borders, multiple customs regimes, multiple legal systems, and multiple currencies, was replaced by a single political entity within which goods, people, and ideas could move with relative freedom. The Abbasid Caliphate's capital, Baghdad, founded in 762 CE on the Tigris River near the ruins of the old Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon, quickly became the largest and wealthiest city in the world, surpassing even Chang'an in population and commercial activity. Baghdad's founding was itself a Silk Road story. The city was designed from the start as a hub of trade, built at the intersection of major land and water routes connecting the Mediterranean with Central Asia, India, and the Persian Gulf. Its circular plan, unique in Islamic urbanism, placed the Caliph's palace and the Great Mosque at the center, with markets, workshops, and residential quarters radiating outward in concentric rings. The city's markets handled goods from every corner of the known world: Chinese silk and porcelain, Indian spices and gemstones, Central Asian horses and furs, African ivory and gold, Mediterranean olive oil and wine, and the products of the Islamic world's own increasingly sophisticated manufacturing sector: textiles, ceramics, or metalwork, paper, and books. Paper is worth pausing over because its journey along the Silk Road is one of the most consequential technology transfers in human history. Papermaking was invented in China, traditionally attributed to the court official Xie Lun in 105 CE, though archaeological evidence suggests that crude forms of paper existed somewhat earlier. For centuries, the technology remained a Chinese monopoly, just as silk production had been. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE, the same battle that marked the western limit of Tang expansion, is traditionally credited with breaking that monopoly. According to Arab sources, Chinese papermakers were among the prisoners captured at Talas, and they were brought to Samarkand, where they taught their craft to local artisans. Within decades, paper mills had been established throughout the Islamic world. By the 9th century, Baghdad was a major center of paper production, and paper had replaced papyrus and parchment as the primary writing material across the Islamic Caliphate. The consequences were revolutionary. Paper was cheaper, more abundant, and easier to produce than either papyrus or parchment. Its availability made possible the Islamic Golden Age's extraordinary explosion of intellectual activity. The translation of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts into Arabic, the founding of great libraries and houses of learning, the flourishing of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, philosophy, and literature that made the Islamic world the most intellectually dynamic civilization on Earth between approximately 800 and 1200 CE. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, founded in Baghdad by the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, was arguably the single most important intellectual institution of the medieval world, and its work depended entirely on the availability of cheap, abundant paper, a technology that had traveled from China along the Silk Road to make it possible. The Islamic world's engagement with the Silk Road was not merely commercial or intellectual, it was also profoundly spiritual. Islam, like Buddhism before it, traveled the Silk Road with merchants and missionaries spreading not by conquest alone but through the quiet persuasion of trading relationships. A Muslim merchant who dealt honestly, who extended credit generously, who prayed 5 times daily with visible devotion, was a more effective missionary than any army. The conversion of Central Asia to Islam was a gradual process spanning several centuries. The Turkic peoples of the steppe and the oasis kingdoms of the Silk Road adopted Islam not in response to military pressure, but through sustained contact with Muslim traders who demonstrated the practical and spiritual benefits of their faith. The Sogdians, those master merchants of the Silk Road, converted to Islam over the course of the 8th and 9th centuries, and in doing so, they brought their commercial networks and expertise into the Islamic trading world. The transition was not always smooth. There were resistances, revolts, and periods of coercion, but the end result was a Silk Road that was in its western and central sections increasingly unified by a shared faith, a shared language of commerce, Arabic, and a shared set of legal and ethical principles governing trade, Islamic commercial law, which included sophisticated rules about contracts, partnerships, credit, and the prohibition of certain forms of interest. The world of the medieval Silk Road, the period from roughly the 8th to the 12th centuries, was, despite its political fragmentation and periodic violence, an era of extraordinary connectivity. The Islamic caliphates in the west and center, the Tang and later Song dynasties in the east, the various Turkic and Mongol empires on the steppe, and the Indian kingdoms of the subcontinent all participated in a network of exchange that, while less unified than the classical era Silk Road, was in many ways richer and more complex. The goods that moved along this network reflected the growing sophistication of all the civilizations it connected. Chinese ceramics, particularly the translucent jade-like porcelain that Chinese potters perfected during the Tang and Song dynasties, replaced silk as the most sought-after Chinese export. Porcelain, like silk, was a technology that other civilizations could not replicate, and its beauty, durability, and versatility made it valuable from Japan to England. Fragments of Chinese porcelain have been found in archaeological sites across the entire Silk Road network, from the ruins of medieval Japanese temples to the garbage heaps of medieval Cairo. Islamic textiles, meanwhile, competed with and sometimes surpassed Chinese silk in the markets of the medieval world. The Tiraz workshops of Egypt, Syria, East and Persia produced fabrics of extraordinary quality, often embroidered with Arabic inscriptions that identified the workshop, the ruling caliph, and sometimes the specific occasion for which the fabric was made. These textiles traveled the Silk Road in both directions, eastward into Central Asia and China, and westward into Europe, where they were prized as luxury goods and sometimes used to wrap the relics of Christian saints, an irony that would have amused the Muslim craftsmen who made them. The intellectual exchange of this period was, if anything, more consequential than the commercial one. Arabic numerals, the decimal number system including the concept of zero, originally developed in India and transmitted to the Islamic world via the Silk Road, revolutionized mathematics throughout Eurasia. The works of al-Khwarizmi, the 9th century Baghdad mathematician whose name gives us the word algorithm and whose book Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala gives us the word algebra, drew on both Indian and Greek mathematical traditions to create a synthesis that would eventually transform European science. The transmission chain ran from Indian mathematicians to Silk Road to Baghdad to Arabic translation to eventual Latin translation in medieval Europe to the scientific revolution. Medical knowledge followed similar pathways. The canon of medicine compiled by Ibn Sina, Avicenna in the 11th century drew on Greek, Indian, and Chinese medical traditions, synthesized them into a comprehensive system. and was itself translated into Latin, becoming the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. The astronomical observations of Central Asian scholars like al-Biruni, who spent years in India and wrote detailed descriptions of Indian mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, depended on the access that Silk Road connections provided. Even Chinese technological innovations, the compass, gunpowder, and printing, moved westward along Silk Road channels, though the precise pathways and timings of these transfers remain debated by historians. The Silk Road's medieval period was not, however, a golden age of peaceful coexistence. The routes were contested, disrupted, and periodically severed by the same forces that had always threatened them: political instability, military conflict, and the unpredictable violence of the steppe. The Turkic migrations that reshaped Central Asia from the 6th century onward brought new powers into the Silk Road equation: the Western and Eastern Turkic Khaganites, the Uyghur Empire, the Karakhanids, the Ghaznavids, each of which controlled segments of the network and extracted tolls from passing trade. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, disrupted the western terminus of the Silk Road by introducing a new military conflict into the already complex politics of the eastern Mediterranean. The Khitan Liao dynasty and the Jurchen Jin dynasty competed for control of northern China and the eastern Silk Road terminus. And beneath these political upheavals, a quieter but more consequential shift was underway. The center of gravity in global trade was moving from land to sea. Chinese maritime technology, the compass, the stern post rudder, watertight compartments, and advanced sail designs was making sea travel faster, safer, and more economical than overland caravan routes. The Song dynasty, which ruled southern China from 1127 to 1279, was a maritime civilization to a degree that no previous Chinese dynasty had been, with a merchant fleet that dominated Asian waters and a foreign trade policy that actively encouraged seaborne commerce. The ports of Guangzhou, and Hangzhou handled volumes of trade that dwarfed anything moving along the overland routes. The overland Silk Road was not dead. It still carried luxury goods, diplomats, and ideas. It still sustained the oasis towns and caravan cities that had grown up along its length, but its relative importance was declining. And it might have continued declining indefinitely had it not been for the arrival of the most improbable force in the history of the steppe, a force that would, in the space of a single lifetime, unite the entire length of the Silk Road under one authority for the first and only time in human history. In the year 1206, in a river valley on the eastern Mongolian steppe, a man who had been born with the name Temujin, and who had spent his youth in poverty, exile, and the constant threat of violent death, was proclaimed universal ruler of the Mongol tribes. He took the title Chinggis Khan, a title whose precise meaning is debated, but which is generally rendered as universal ruler or oceanic ruler. He was approximately 44 years old. He commanded perhaps 100,000 mounted warriors. And he was about to build the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The Mongol conquests are often reduced in popular imagination to a narrative of destruction. Cities burned, populations massacred, civilizations obliterated, and there is truth in this image. The Mongol destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 to 1221 was one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. The cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Merv, Nishapur, and Herat, jewels of the Islamic world, centers of learning, art, and commerce that had flourished for centuries, were systematically destroyed, their populations killed or enslaved, their irrigation systems wrecked, their libraries burned. The death toll is debated, but was certainly in the millions. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire was so thorough that some of the affected regions did not recover their pre-Mongol population levels for centuries. Yet this destruction is only half the story, because after the Mongols destroyed, they built. And what they built, among other things, was the most efficient transcontinental communication and trade network the world had ever seen. The Mongol Empire at its height in the late 13th century stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It encompassed China, Central Asia, Persia, Russia, and significant portions of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. For the first time in history, a single political authority controlled the entire length of the Silk Road, from the Pacific coast to the borders of Western Europe. And the Mongols, whatever their reputation for savagery and war, understood perfectly well that a unified empire required functioning trade routes. The result was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a period of approximately a century, from roughly 1250 to 1350, during which travel and trade across the breadth of Eurasia was safer, faster, and more voluminous than it had ever been or would be again until the modern era. The Mongols achieved this through a combination of political unification, infrastructural investment, and sheer terror. The Yam system, a network of relay stations spaced approximately every 40 kilometers across the entire empire, allowed messages and travelers to move at extraordinary speed. A rider carrying an imperial message could cover up to 300 kilometers per day by changing horses at each station, crossing the entire empire in a matter of weeks. The stations provided fresh horses, food, shelter, and sometimes armed escorts for travelers carrying the imperial paisa, a tablet of authority that guaranteed safe passage and the cooperation of all Mongol subjects. Merchants, diplomats, and missionaries who obtained a paisa could travel from one end of the Eurasian continent to the other with a reasonable expectation of arriving alive and unmolested. The Mongols also enforced a degree of legal uniformity across their empire that had no precedent in Eurasian history. The Yasa, the legal code attributed to Chinggis Khan, established rules governing commerce, property rights, diplomatic immunity, and the punishment of crimes that applied uniformly across the empire's vast territory. A merchant who was robbed on the Silk Road could appeal to Mongol authorities for restitution, and the punishment for highway robbery was severe enough to serve as an effective deterrent. The Mongols did not tolerate threats to commerce, not because they were idealists, but because they understood that trade generated the tax revenue on which their empire depended. The effects of the Pax Mongolica on Silk Road trade were immediate and dramatic. European merchants, who had previously relied on intermediaries for access to Eastern goods, began traveling directly to China for the first time. The most famous of these travelers was, of course, Marco Polo. Marco Polo was born in Venice around 1254 into a family of Venetian merchants who had already established connections with the Mongol court. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo had traveled to the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Chinggis Khan, who had conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty in the 1260s, and had returned to Venice carrying a letter from the Khan requesting that the Pope send 100 Christian scholars to his court. The Pope, occupied with internal politics and the Crusades, sent 2 Dominican friars instead, both of whom turned back before reaching Mongol territory. Niccolo and Maffeo returned to the Mongol court in 1271, this time bringing the 17-year-old Marco. The journey took approximately 3.5 years, following the overland Silk Road through Persia, Central Asia, and across the Gobi Desert to Kublai Khan's summer capital at Chengdu, the Xanadu of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem. Marco spent approximately 17 years in the Mongol Empire, traveling extensively throughout China, Southeast Asia, and possibly India, apparently serving in various administrative capacities for the Khan. He returned to Venice by sea around 1295, traveling through Southeast Asia, India, and Persia, and arriving home after an absence of 24 years. Marco Polo's account of his travels, commonly known as the Travels of Marco Polo or Il Milione, was dictated to a fellow prisoner named Rusticello da Pisa while Marco was held captive following a naval battle between Venice and Genoa. The book describes China's cities, its paper money, its coal burning, which astonished Europeans who used only wood, its postal system, its vast population, and its sophisticated administration. It describes Kublai Khan's court in terms that struck European readers as either fantastical or fraudulent. It describes the wealth of the East in superlatives that earned Marco the nickname Il Milione, the man of millions, from skeptics who believed he was exaggerating. The reliability of Marco Polo's account has been debated for 7 centuries. Skeptics note that he fails to mention the Great Wall, Chinese tea drinking, foot binding, and other features that a genuine resident of China might be expected to describe. Defenders countered that the Great Wall as we know it was largely a Ming Dynasty construction that did not yet exist in its famous form, that tea drinking was primarily a southern Chinese practice that a resident of the Mongol court might not have encountered, and that the omission of specific details does not invalidate the account as a whole. The debate continues, but most modern scholars accept that Marco Polo did travel to China, that he spent an extended period in the Mongol Empire, and that his account, while embellished and occasionally inaccurate, is broadly authentic. Whatever its historical accuracy, the travels of Marco Polo had an incalculable impact on European consciousness. For the first time, European readers had a detailed, vivid, personal account of the civilizations at the eastern end of the Silk Road. The book inspired generations of travelers, merchants, and explorers, including 2 centuries later, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who carried a heavily annotated copy of Marco Polo's travels on his first voyage to the Americas. The Silk Road had, through Marco Polo's words, planted a seed in the European imagination that would eventually grow into the age of exploration, the era that would render the Silk Road itself obsolete. But Marco Polo was not the only European traveler of the Pax Mongolica, nor even the most historically significant one. The Franciscan friar John of Plano Carpini traveled to the Mongol court in 1245 to 1247, and his account, the Historia Mongolorum, was the first detailed European description of the Mongol Empire. William of Rubruck, another Franciscan, traveled to the Mongol court in 1253 to 1255 and left an account that modern historians consider more reliable than Marco Polo's. The merchant Francesco Balducci Pegolotti, writing around 1340, produced a practical guide to the overland trade route from the Black Sea to China, including advice on which interpreters to hire, which goods to carry, and how much security was needed at each stage of the journey. His guide assumes that the route is safe enough for routine commercial travel, a remarkable testament to the security that the Pax Mongolica had established. Other travelers moved in the opposite direction. Rabban Bar Sauma, a Turkic Christian monk born near Beijing, traveled from China to Europe in the 1280s, essentially a reverse Marco Polo. Visiting Constantinople, Rome, Paris, and Bordeaux, where he met with European kings and the Pope. His journey is one of the most remarkable and least known episodes of Silk Road history, demonstrating that the Pax Mongolica facilitated movement in both directions with equal ease. The Pax Mongolica's most consequential legacy, however, was not the travel accounts of European missionaries or the commercial enterprises of Venetian merchants. It was something far smaller, far more lethal, and far more transformative than anything that moved along the Silk Road in human hands. It was a bacterium. Yersinia pestis Brassinianiron, the pathogen that causes bubonic plague, had existed in rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe for millennia. It was endemic to the marmot and ground squirrel populations that lived in the grasslands, maintained in a stable cycle of infection and recovery that kept the bacterium alive without producing epidemic disease in human populations. Occasional spillover events, moments when the bacterium jumped from rodent to flea to human, had occurred throughout history, in producing localized outbreaks that flared and subsided without spreading beyond the immediate region. But the Pax Mongolica changed the ecology of plague. The vast increase in human traffic along the Silk Road, merchants, soldiers, diplomats, monks, and their animals, created new pathways for the bacterium to move far beyond its Central Asian reservoir. Fleas carried in the fur of rats that nested in grain shipments and caravan goods traveled the same routes as silk and spices. The dense relay station network of the Yam system, where travelers and their goods were concentrated in small spaces at regular intervals, created ideal conditions for transmission. The plague appears to have begun its westward journey in the 1330s, spreading from Central Asian reservoirs along Silk Road trade routes toward the Black Sea. By 1346, it had reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, where a Mongol army besieging the Genoese trading post allegedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, one of history's earliest documented instances of biological warfare, though the story may be apocryphal and the plague likely entered the city through more mundane channels. Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa carried the plague by ship to Constantinople, and from there it spread throughout the Mediterranean and into Europe. The result was the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in recorded history. Between 1347 and 1353, the plague killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia, roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population, with comparable mortality rates in the Middle East, and unknown but likely significant mortality in Central and East Asia. The social, economic, political, and psychological consequences were incalculable. Entire communities were annihilated. Labor shortages upended feudal economic systems. Religious faith was shaken by the apparent indifference of God to human suffering. Art, literature, and philosophy were transformed by the omnipresence of death. The Black Death traveled the Silk Road. It was carried by the same network of routes and relay stations that carried silk, spices, paper, and ideas. It was facilitated by the same political unity and commercial connectivity that made the Pax Mongolica possible. The very openness that allowed Marco Polo to travel from Venice to Beijing also allowed Yersinia Pestis to travel from the Central Asian steppe to the streets of Florence. The Silk Road, which had carried so much of beauty and wonder across the breadth of the ancient world, also carried death on a scale that no human agency could have accomplished. This was not an accident or an irony, it was a structural feature of connectivity itself. Networks that transmit goods also transmit disease. Trade routes that accelerate the movement of people also accelerate the movement of pathogens. The Silk Road's greatest achievement, binding the civilizations of Eurasia into a single web of exchange, was inseparable from its greatest catastrophe. They were the same thing, viewed from different angles. The Mongol Empire did not survive the 14th century as a unified polity. It had already fragmented into four major successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. By the late 13th century, and these successor states themselves fragmented further over the following decades. The Black Death accelerated the process of dissolution, killing leaders and soldiers and subjects with the same democratic impartiality it showed everywhere. By the mid-14th century, the political unity that had sustained the Pax Mongolica was gone. In China, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol regime that Kublai Khan had established, was overthrown in 1368 by a Chinese rebel movement that established the Ming dynasty. The Ming were, from the outset, a deliberately inward-looking regime, suspicious of foreign influence and committed to restoring what they saw as authentically Chinese cultural traditions after a century of Mongol rule. They rebuilt the Great Wall in the massive stone and brick form that tourists photograph today, a physical manifestation of their desire to seal China's northern border against the steppe. They moved the capital from the cosmopolitan southern city of Nanjing to Beijing, closer to the northern frontier where they could monitor the Mongol threat. And while they did not sever Silk Road connections entirely, they showed none of the Tang dynasty's enthusiasm for foreign trade and cultural exchange. The Ming dynasty's most dramatic engagement with the outside world was not overland but maritime. Between 1405 and 1433, the Muslim eunuch admiral Zheng He led 7 massive naval expeditions through Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the East African coast. His fleet was enormous by any standard, hundreds of ships, including treasure ships that may have been over 100 meters long, dwarfing anything contemporary European navies could build. The expeditions were not primarily commercial. They were demonstrations of Ming imperial prestige, designed to awe foreign rulers and collect tribute. But they demonstrated China's maritime capability and its potential to dominate Asian sea lanes. And then they stopped. After the last expedition in 1433, the Ming court abruptly terminated the maritime voyages, dismantled the fleet, and made it illegal to build ocean-going vessels with more than 2 masts. The reasons are debated, Confucian bureaucrats who resented the eunuch admiral's influence, fiscal pressures from the maintenance of the northern frontier, ideological opposition to foreign entanglements, but the consequences were clear. As China withdrew from the maritime world at precisely the moment when European powers were beginning to enter it. The Portuguese were already pushing down the West African coast, developing the ships and navigation techniques that would carry them around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean within decades. The Spanish were funding increasingly ambitious Atlantic voyages that would, in 1492, stumble upon the Americas. The Silk Road's overland routes were not dead, but they were diminished. The political fragmentation of the post-Mongol world meant that no single authority guaranteed safe passage from end to end. Local warlords, bandit kingdoms, and competing tribal confederacies controlled individual segments of the route, each demanding tolls and offering protection of varying reliability. The oasis towns that had flourished for centuries began to contract, their populations dwindling as trade volumes fell. The Sogdian merchant networks that had once spanned the continent had long since dissolved into the Islamic commercial world, and no comparable intermediary network had risen to replace them. The final major attempt to recreate the overland Silk Road's imperial framework came from Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a Central Asian conqueror of Turco-Mongol descent who built a vast empire from his capital at Samarkand in the late 14th century. Timur's conquests were as destructive as anything the Mongols had achieved. He sacked Delhi, Damascus, and Baghdad, and his campaigns left pyramids of skulls at the gates of conquered cities. But Timur also invested heavily in Samarkand, in transforming it into one of the most magnificent cities in the world. He brought captured craftsmen from every conquered territory to build mosques, madrasas, gardens, and palaces of astonishing beauty. The Registan Square in Samarkand, with its 3 great madrasas facing each other across a central plaza, remains one of the architectural wonders of the Islamic world, and it was built in part with the profits of Silk Road trade. Timur died in 1405, on the march toward China, and his empire fragmented after his death, as steppe empires almost always did. The Timurid successor states maintained Samarkand's cultural brilliance for another century. The astronomer Ulugh Beg, Timur's grandson, he built an observatory in Samarkand whose star catalog was the most accurate in the world until the work of Tycho Brahe, but they could not recreate the political unity that had sustained the Silk Road's great eras of prosperity. The overland routes continued to function, carrying goods and ideas at reduced volumes through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, but the center of gravity in global trade had shifted decisively and irreversibly to the sea. The Portuguese discovery of the sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, accomplished by Vasco da Gama, guided by an Arab navigator whose knowledge derived from centuries of Indian Ocean trade, broke the overland Silk Road's monopoly on east-west trade. Goods that had once taken months to cross Central Asia by camel could now be shipped by sea in weeks. You were at lower cost in larger quantities and without the accumulated tolls of dozens of middlemen and border crossings. The old caravan paths grew quieter. The oasis towns shrank. The caravanserais emptied. Sand drifted across the trade routes, covering the tracks of countless caravans, burying the remains of roadside shrines and abandoned way station walls. The Silk Road as a functioning commercial network was fading into history, but its legacy was not fading. It was embedded in the DNA of civilizations across the breadth of Eurasia, carried in the languages people spoke, the foods they ate, the gods they worshipped, the numbers they used to count, the medicines they took when they were sick, and the stories they told their children at night. The Silk Road had not merely connected civilizations, it had created them, shaped them, enriched them, challenged them, and sometimes destroyed them. It had demonstrated over 2,000 years and 7,000 kilometers the most fundamental truth about human civilization, that no culture thrives in isolation. that the movement of goods implies the movement of ideas, and the movement of ideas transforms everything it touches. And at the very end, the Silk Road's most profound legacy might be its simplest one. Somewhere in the 2nd century BCE, a young man accepted a jade staff and walked through a gate into the unknown, carrying nothing but curiosity and courage, and a set of instructions that assumed the world was larger than anyone in his homeland had imagined. He was right. The world was larger. And because he walked into it, because he came back and told the story of what he had found, the world became, and for the first time, connected in ways that could never be fully undone. The caravans are gone now. The camels no longer plod across the Taklamakan's edge. The relay stations have crumbled to dust, but the connections remain. In the silk that still shimmers in museum cases, in the Buddhist statues that still stand in Chinese caves, in the Arabic numerals that still fill the pages of every mathematics textbook on earth, in the spices that still season food from Mumbai to Manhattan. The Silk Road is not a road, it is a memory. And like all true memories, it is not behind us. It is within us, shaping who we are and how we see the world, whether we know it or not. The stars that Zheng Qian navigated by still shine above the desert. The wind still moves across the dunes with the same unhurried patience it has always had. And somewhere in the silence between those stars and that wind, if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear it. The faint jingle of camel bells, the creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on sand, carrying the world's goods and the world's ideas and the world's hopes toward a horizon that never stops receding and never stops calling. This is the end of Part 1. Part 2 will continue with a deeper exploration of the Silk Road's maritime dimensions, the rise and fall of its final great cities, the archaeological rediscovery of its buried treasures, and the modern echoes of history's greatest network of human connection. Part 2. The sea that would eventually replace the Silk Road's overland routes as the primary artery of global trade was not a single body of water, but a chain of interconnected oceans, straits, and coastal passages that stretched from the South China Sea through the Malacca Strait, across the Indian Ocean, into the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and from there to the Mediterranean. This maritime network was not new. It was in many ways older than the overland Silk Road itself. Sailors from the Arabian Peninsula had been trading with the western coast of India since at least the 3rd millennium BCE. Indian merchants had been sailing to Southeast Asia since the early centuries of the Common Era. And Chinese junks had been plying the waters between Guangzhou and the ports of Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula for centuries before anyone in Europe had heard of Marco Polo. What changed in the 15th and 16th centuries was not the existence of maritime trade, but its scale, its reach, and, most critically, the identity of the people who controlled it. For most of its history, the maritime Silk Road had been dominated by the same civilizations that dominated the overland routes: Chinese, Indian, Arab, and Persian merchants who understood the monsoon winds, who had developed the navigational techniques and shipbuilding technologies required for ocean crossings, and who maintained the port cities and trading networks that made long-distance sea trade possible. The Indian Ocean, in particular, had been for centuries what the historian K.N. Chowdhury called a world of trade, a vast commercial zone knit together by the predictable rhythm of the monsoon, which blew ships southwestward from Arabia and East Africa to India between April and September, and northeastward from India back to Arabia between October and March. A merchant who understood the monsoon could plan a round trip with reasonable precision, departing one port with the favorable wind and arriving at his destination weeks or months later, conducting business during the season of unfavorable wind, and then riding the reversed monsoon home. The monsoon system created a natural rhythm of trade that shaped every aspect of maritime Silk Road life. Port cities became seasonal hubs of activity, their populations swelling during trading seasons as ships from distant lands crowded their harbors and merchants from a dozen cultures filled their markets. Between seasons, the ports quieted, the warehouses were sealed, and the resident merchant communities, Arabs in Calicut, Chinese in Malacca, Indians in Hormuz, settled into the routines of their expatriate lives, in maintaining the social and commercial relationships that would be activated again when the winds changed. The greatest of these port cities was, for much of the medieval period, not a city on the Silk Road's traditional western terminus, but one at its maritime crossroads, Calicut, on the Malabar coast of southwestern India. Calicut, not to be confused with Calcutta, the later British colonial city on India's eastern coast, was the capital of the Zamorin, the Hindu ruler of a small but commercially powerful kingdom that controlled a stretch of the Kerala coast. Calicut's importance derived not from military power or territorial extent, but from its position at the junction of the Indian Ocean's two great trading systems, the Western system, which connected India with Arabia, Persia, East Africa, and ultimately the Mediterranean, and the Eastern system, which connected India with Southeast Asia, China, and the Spice Islands of modern Indonesia. Calicut was where these two systems met, and the Zamorin had built his kingdom's prosperity on the simple principle of welcoming all traders of whatever origin or faith and taxing them fairly. The result was one of the most cosmopolitan commercial centers in the medieval world. Arab and Persian merchants maintained permanent trading communities in Calicut, living in their own neighborhoods, worshiping in their own mosques, governed by their own laws in matters of personal and religious affairs, but subject to the Zamorin's commercial regulations in matters of trade. Chinese merchants visited regularly, exchanging porcelain, silk, and copper coins for the pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, and ginger that grew in the forested hills behind the coast. Jewish traders from the Middle East maintained a small but ancient presence, their community dating back, according to local tradition, to the era of King Solomon. And Indian merchants, Hindus, Jains, and later Muslims formed the commercial backbone of the city, handling the local end of transactions that connected Kerala's spice-rich hinterland with the global trading network. Pepper was Calicut's gold. Black pepper, Piper nigrum, grew abundantly in the western Ghats, the mountain range that runs parallel to India's southwestern coast. And the Malabar coast had been the world's primary source of pepper since antiquity. The Roman Empire had imported Malabar pepper in quantities that scandalized Roman moralists. The medieval Islamic world consumed it voraciously. And European demand for pepper, which had been growing steadily since the Crusades introduced European palates to the spiced cuisines of the Eastern Mediterranean, was by the 15th century the single most powerful economic force driving European interest in the East. It was pepper, more than silk or porcelain or precious stones, that drew the Portuguese around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. And it was at Calicut in May 1498 that the maritime revolution that would ultimately destroy the Silk Road's overland routes announced its arrival. Vasco da Gama's fleet, 4 small ships carrying approximately 170 men, arrived at Calicut after a voyage of nearly 11 months from Lisbon. The Portuguese had been working toward this moment for almost a century, since Prince Henry the Navigator had begun sponsoring voyages of exploration down the West African coast in the 1420s. Each successive expedition had pushed a little further south, each one refining the Portuguese understanding of Atlantic wind patterns, ocean currents, and coastal geography, until Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected and that a sea route from Europe to Asia was physically possible. Da Gama's achievement in reaching Calicut was navigational rather than commercial. His initial reception by the Zamorin was courteous but unimpressed. The gifts he offered, striped cloth, coral beads, sugar, and honey, were the trade goods of the West African coast, and was suitable for barter with the relatively unsophisticated societies the Portuguese had encountered there. In the markets of Calicut, where merchants routinely handled Chinese porcelain, Persian metalwork, and Arabian horses, da Gama's offerings were received with barely concealed contempt. When asked what he had come to find, da Gama reportedly replied, "Christians and spices," a formulation that neatly encapsulated the twin motivations of Portuguese expansion: the religious crusading impulse inherited from the Reconquista and the commercial hunger for direct access to the Eastern luxury trade that had for centuries enriched the Italian city-states and their Arab and Persian intermediaries. Da Gama returned to Portugal with a small cargo of pepper and cinnamon that, despite its modest size, AE returned a profit of 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. The message was clear. The Portuguese had found the sea route to the source of the spice trade, and whoever controlled that route would control the most profitable commerce in the world. What followed was not a gradual commercial transition, but a violent seizure. The Portuguese did not integrate themselves into the existing Indian Ocean trading system. They disrupted it. Pedro Álvares Cabral, who led the second Portuguese expedition to India in 1500, bombarded Calicut with ship-mounted cannon when commercial negotiations broke down, an act of violence that was without precedent in Indian Ocean trade, where commercial disputes had traditionally been resolved through negotiation, arbitration, and the threat of economic boycott rather than naval bombardment. Now, the Portuguese possessed a military technology, a ship-mounted heavy cannon, that no Indian Ocean power could match, and they used it with a ruthlessness that reshaped the balance of power in Asian waters within a generation. Afonso de Albuquerque, the architect of the Portuguese maritime empire, captured Goa on India's western coast in 1510 Malacca, the great entrepot of Southeast Asian trade, in 1511, and Hormuz, the gateway to the Persian Gulf, in 1515. These three conquests gave Portugal control of the three critical choke points in Indian Ocean trade, allowing them to tax, regulate, and when necessary blockade the flow of goods between East and West. The Portuguese introduced the cartaz system, a requirement that all ships operating in the Indian Ocean carry a Portuguese license or face seizure, which amounted to a protection racket on an oceanic scale. Ships that carried the cartaz paid a fee but were allowed to trade. Ships that did not were subject to confiscation of their cargo and frequently the destruction of the vessel and the murder of its crew. The Portuguese maritime empire was never large in territorial terms. Portugal's total population in the 16th century was perhaps 1.5 million, fewer people than lived in a single Chinese province. The Portuguese could not control the Indian Ocean in the way that the Mongols had controlled the steppe. What they could do was control key nodes in the network, ports, straits, and island bases, and project enough naval power to make those nodes into toll gates. The effect was to divert a significant portion of the east-west luxury trade from its traditional overland and maritime channels into a new channel that terminated not in Baghdad or Cairo or Constantinople, but in Lisbon. The impact on the overland Silk Road was indirect but devastating. The Portuguese sea route did not immediately replace the overland routes. Central Asian trade in horses, furs, and precious stones continued, and the pilgrim traffic along the Silk Road's Buddhist and Islamic circuits maintained some of its old volume. But the sea route offered lower costs, higher volumes, and faster transit times for the goods that had been the Silk Road's most profitable cargo: spices, silk, porcelain, and precious metals. Merchants who had once sent their goods by camel across the deserts of Central Asia now sent them by ship around the Cape of Good Hope. The economic logic was irresistible. The caravanserais of the overland Silk Road did not close overnight, but their guest rooms grew emptier with each passing decade, and the men who maintained them found fewer and fewer reasons to keep the lamps lit. The Portuguese were only the first Europeans to force their way into the Asian maritime trading system. The Spanish, working westward across the Atlantic and Pacific, reached the Philippines in the 1520s and established Manila as a permanent colony in 1571. Manila became the terminus of the Manila galleon trade, a trans-Pacific route connecting the silver mines of Spanish America with the markets of China, where silver was valued at roughly twice its European price. For 2.5 centuries, from 1565 to 1815, 1 or 2 galleons per year crossed the Pacific from Acapulco to Manila, carrying Mexican silver, and returned laden with Chinese silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and spices. The Manila Galleon trade was, in a sense, a maritime Silk Road that bypassed Eurasia entirely, connecting China directly with the Americas through the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. The Dutch followed the Portuguese into Asian waters in the late 16th century, bringing with them a commercial ruthlessness that made the Portuguese look gentle by comparison. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, founded in 1602, was the world's first multinational corporation. It capitalized at a level that dwarfed any previous commercial enterprise and empowered by the Dutch government to wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, and administer justice in the company's name. The VOC systematically dismantled the Portuguese monopoly in Asian waters, seizing Malacca in 1641, expelling the Portuguese from Sri Lanka and the Malabar coast, and establishing its own network of trading posts and colonies from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. The VOC's headquarters in Asia was Batavia, modern Jakarta, which became the hub of a commercial empire that controlled the spice trade with a completeness that the Portuguese had never achieved. The English East India Company, founded in 1600, initially operated in the shadow of the VOC, unable to match Dutch capital or naval power. Being shut out of the most profitable spice-producing regions by Dutch monopoly, the English focused on the Indian subcontinent, establishing trading posts at Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta that would eventually grow into the British Raj, the largest colonial empire in history. The trajectory from trading post to territorial empire was gradual and largely unplanned, driven by the local dynamics of Indian politics, the competitive pressures of European rivalry, and the institutional logic of a commercial organization that found, time and again, that the cheapest way to protect trade was to control the territory where the trade occurred. The cumulative effect of European maritime expansion was to redirect global trade flows away from the overland routes that had sustained the Silk Road for 2 millennia and into oceanic channels that European navies could monitor, tax, and defend. The Indian Ocean, which had been an open commercial commons for centuries, became a contested space where European firepower determined who could trade, on what terms, and at what price. The overland routes through Central Asia, the routes that Zhang Qian had pioneered, that Sogdian merchants had dominated, that Mongol relay stations had serviced, became backwaters. The cities that had grown up along those routes, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, Khotan, Dunhuang, declined in wealth and population. The great caravan trade that had once sustained them dwindled to a trickle of local commerce, in carrying goods between neighboring oases rather than between civilizations. The people who suffered most from this transformation were the people who had always depended most on the Silk Road, the inhabitants of the oasis towns and the Central Asian steppe. Cut off from the global trading networks that had sustained their economies for centuries, these communities experienced a slow, grinding contraction that continued for 400 years. Towns that had once boasted populations of tens of thousands shrank to villages of a few hundred. Irrigation systems that required communal labor and significant resources to maintain fell into disrepair as populations declined, reducing the agricultural base that supported what remained. Libraries were neglected, their contents moldering in sealed rooms. Temples and mosques that had once been centers of learning became provincial shrines, their scholarly traditions attenuated to a few memorized texts recited by men who had no access to the wider intellectual world that had created them. The Silk Road's cities did not die dramatically, consumed by fire or conquest. They died slowly of neglect and irrelevance, their populations trickling away toward the coasts and the new centers of global commerce that the maritime revolution had created. By the 18th century, the great overland routes were quieter than they had been at any point since Zhang Qian's era. The Taklamakan's dunes crept over abandoned waypoints. The caravanserais that had once echoed with a dozen languages fell silent, their roofs caving in, their courtyards filling with blown sand. The Silk Road had become a ghost road, haunted by the memory of a connectivity that the modern world had made obsolete. And then, in a development that Zhang Qian or Xuanzang or Marco Polo might have appreciated for its narrative symmetry, the Silk Road was rediscovered, not by merchants or monks or diplomats, but by archaeologists, linguists, and adventurers drawn to the desert by rumors of buried cities and forgotten civilizations. The rediscovery of the Silk Road's physical remains is one of the great archaeological dramas of the modern era. A story of obsessive scholars, geopolitical rivalry, and treasures pulled from the sand that rewrote the history of human civilization. It began in the last decades of the 19th century, when European and Russian imperial expansion into Central Asia brought scholars and soldiers into contact with landscapes littered with ruins that no one in the modern world could explain. The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin was among the first Europeans to penetrate the Taklamakan's edges and return with reports of what he had found. In 1895, Hedin stumbled upon the ruins of a town near the ancient oasis of Khotan, a town that had been buried by sand for centuries, its buildings preserved in the dry desert air with an eerie completeness. Walls still stood, wooden beams still supported collapsed roofs, and scattered among the ruins were objects, coins, pottery fragments, carved wooden panels, scraps of fabric that testified to a community that had lived, traded, and worshipped along the Silk Road before the desert reclaimed it. Hedin's discoveries electrified the scholarly world and triggered what has been called the race for Central Asia, a competitive scramble among European powers to explore, excavate, and carry off the archaeological treasures of the Silk Road. The competitors were driven by a combination of genuine scholarly curiosity, imperial prestige, and the straightforward desire to fill museum cases in London, Paris, Berlin, St. Petersburg, and Tokyo with spectacular artifacts from the exotic East. The most controversial and consequential of these archaeological adventurers was Aurel Stein, the same man who had discovered the Sogdian ancient letters in the Great Wall Watchtower. Stein was a Hungarian-born British citizen, a scholar of Sanskrit and Persian, and a man of extraordinary physical endurance who conducted 4 major expeditions into Chinese Central Asia between 1900 and 1930. He was small, wiry, relentlessly energetic, and possessed of a combination of linguistic skill, archaeological intuition, and diplomatic cunning that made him uniquely effective in extracting treasures from remote and politically sensitive sites. Stein's greatest achievement and greatest controversy came at the Mogao Caves near Dunhuang. In 1907, Stein arrived at the caves and learned that a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had appointed himself guardian of the site, had recently discovered a sealed cave, Cave 17, the Library Cave, containing an enormous cache of manuscripts and printed documents. Wang had reported his discovery to local officials who had shown little interest. Stein, recognizing the potential significance of the find, undertook a campaign of patient persuasion, cultivating Wang's trust over weeks of conversation, appealing to the monk's admiration for Xuanzang, whose memory Stein invoked as a spiritual precedent for the cross-cultural transfer of Buddhist texts, and eventually offering a modest donation to Wang's restoration fund in exchange for access to the cave's contents. What Stein removed from Cave 17 was one of the most important collections of historical documents ever assembled. Approximately 10,000 manuscripts and printed texts, along with paintings, textiles, and devotional objects, were packed into cases and shipped to the British Museum and the British Library in London. The collection included the Diamond Sutra of 868 CE, the world's oldest dated printed book, along with Buddhist sutras in Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Khotanese, Taoist philosophical texts, Confucian classics, government documents, commercial contracts, medical texts, astronomical tables, and the Sogdian ancient letters that had already revolutionized scholarly understanding of Silk Road commerce. The removal of these materials remains one of the most contentious episodes in the history of archaeology. Chinese scholars and officials have argued with considerable justification that Stein's acquisition of the Dunhuang manuscripts was an act of cultural theft, facilitated by a combination of colonial arrogance and the exploitation of a naive guardian. In Stein's defenders counter that Wang Yuanlu had already been distributing manuscripts to local officials and had no plan for their systematic preservation, that the Chinese government at the time showed no interest in protecting the collection, and that Stein's removal of the materials to London ensured their survival and their availability to scholars worldwide. The debate is unresolvable because both positions contain truth. What is not debatable is the scholarly significance of the collection. The Dunhuang manuscripts, now dispersed among libraries in London, Paris, Beijing, St. Petersburg, and elsewhere, are the single most important primary source for the history of the medieval Silk Road, and their discovery transformed the field from a matter of textual speculation into a discipline grounded in material evidence. Stein was not alone in the field. Paul Pelliot, a French sinologist of prodigious linguistic ability, he is said to have spoken 13 languages, including Chinese, Tibetan, Mongolian, Turkish, and several Central Asian tongues, arrived at Dunhuang shortly after Stein and acquired his own collection of manuscripts, selected with a scholarly precision that Stein acknowledged as superior to his own. Pelliot spent 3 weeks in the library cave, reading manuscripts by candlelight, identifying and selecting the most historically significant texts with the trained eye of one of the foremost Orientalists of his generation. His collection, now housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, is smaller than Stein's but in some respects more valuable, because Pelliot's selections were guided by deep knowledge of the text's content and significance. German expeditions led by Albert Grunwiedel and Albert von Lecoq focused on the cave temples at Bezeklik, Kizil, and other sites along the northern Silk Road route. They removed large sections of wall paintings, carefully sawing them from the cave walls and packing them in crates for shipment to Berlin's Museum of Asian Art. Many of these paintings were destroyed during the Allied bombing of Berlin in World War II. An irony that underscores both the risks of removing cultural artifacts from their original context and the risks of leaving them in situ in an unstable world. The paintings that survived remain among the finest examples of Silk Road art in any collection. Their vivid colors and diverse iconographic traditions offering a visual record of the cultural mixing that defined the oasis communities of the Taklamakan's edge. Russian expeditions, led by scholars like Sergei Oldenburg and Pyotr Kozlov, explored the eastern reaches of the Silk Road, excavating sites in the Turfan Oasis and the ruins of Kara Koto, a Tangut city on the edge of the Gobi Desert that had been abandoned in the 14th century. Kozlov's excavation of Kara Koto in 1908 to 1909 yielded a treasure trove of Tangut language texts, Buddhist paintings, and artifacts that provided the first detailed glimpse into Tangut civilization, a culture that had been almost entirely lost to history since the Mongol conquest destroyed the Tongut kingdom in 1227. Japanese expeditions, led by Count Otani Kozui and the scholar Zuicho Tachibana, added their own contributions to the dispersal of Silk Road artifacts, acquiring manuscripts and objects from sites across Chinese Central Asia and transporting them to Japan. Chinese scholars, including Luo Jianyu and the great polymath Wang Guowei, worked to acquire and preserve materials that remained in China, building the foundations of a Chinese scholarly tradition focused on the Silk Road that would eventually become the dominant voice in the field. The archaeological recovery of the Silk Road was, in its own way, a replay of the dynamics that had shaped the Silk Road itself. Scholars and adventurers from rival empires competed for access to the same treasures, each driven by a combination of genuine intellectual passion and national prestige. The artifacts they found were distributed across the world, just as the goods that had once traveled the Silk Road had been, ending up in collections from Tokyo to London, from St. Petersburg to New Delhi. And the knowledge that emerged from their discoveries traveled its own network of scholarly exchange, published in journals, presented at conferences, and debated in universities from Beijing to Berlin, creating a modern intellectual Silk Road that mirrored, in its own way, the ancient one. The physical artifacts recovered from the Silk Road's ruins tell stories that no textual source can match. A silk banner from Dunhuang, painted in the 9th century, Ao shows a Buddhist paradise rendered in a style that blends Chinese brushwork with Indian iconographic conventions and Central Asian color palettes, a single object that embodies three civilizations' aesthetic traditions. A carved wooden panel from Nia in the southern Taklamakan shows a figure wearing a distinctly Gandharan-style garment, but rendered with the facial features and hairstyle of a Central Asian Saka. A visual record of a specific moment of cultural encounter that occurred in a specific oasis town at a specific point in history. A fragment of Sassanid silk found in a Japanese temple treasury, carried from Persia to China along the Silk Road, and from China to Japan by a Buddhist pilgrim, demonstrates the astonishing distances that individual objects could travel, accumulating layers of meaning and association with each transfer. The textiles in particular are revelatory. Silk fragments recovered from Silk Road sites show a progression of technical and artistic innovation that charts the spread of knowledge across the continent. Early Chinese silks, exported westward in their original form, are characterized by distinctively Chinese motifs: dragons, phoenixes, cloud patterns, woven in techniques that no other civilization could replicate. By the Sassanid period, Persian silk workshops were producing their own fabrics using techniques learned from Chinese craftsmen, or, according to legend, from silkworm eggs smuggled out of China by Nestorian monks who concealed them in hollow bamboo staffs. Sassanid silks display distinctly Persian motifs: paired animals flanking a tree of life, royal hunt scenes, geometric medallion patterns, executed in techniques that combine Chinese weaving technology with Persian design sensibility. By the Islamic period, Central Asian workshops were producing silks that synthesized Chinese, Persian, and Indian influences into styles so distinctive that art historians can identify their workshop of origin with considerable precision. The movement of artistic motifs along the Silk Road follows patterns as traceable as the movement of trade goods. The vine scroll, a decorative motif of intertwining grapevines, originated in the Greco-Roman world, traveled eastward along the Silk Road, and appears in Buddhist art at Gandhara, in cave paintings at Dunhuang, and eventually in the decorative programs of Chinese Buddhist temples, and where it was transformed into a distinctly Chinese motif that maintained recognizable traces of its Mediterranean origin. The pearl roundel, a circular frame of small circles or dots enclosing a central motif, originated in Sassanid Persian art, spread along the Silk Road in both directions, and appears on textiles, metalwork, and architectural decoration from Japan to France. The lotus flower, central to Buddhist and Hindu iconography, traveled from India westward into Persian and eventually European decorative traditions and eastward into China, where it merged with indigenous Chinese floral motifs to produce the distinctive lotus patterns of Chinese Buddhist art. These motifs were not merely decorative. They were carriers of meaning, cultural codes that communicated religious identity, political allegiance, and social status to anyone who could read them. A silk robe decorated with Sassanid pearl roundels worn in Tang China signaled its wearer's cosmopolitan sophistication and access to foreign luxury goods. A Buddhist painting at Dunhuang that incorporated Gandharan compositional conventions signaled the painter's connection to the Indian Buddhist artistic mainstream. A Chinese porcelain bowl decorated with Islamic arabesques, produced in a Song dynasty kiln for export to the Middle Eastern market, signaled the potter's awareness of his customers' aesthetic preferences and his willingness to adapt his art to foreign tastes. The material culture of the Silk Road is, in the final analysis, a record of human adaptability, of the endless capacity of human beings to absorb foreign influences, transform them into something new, and send the result onward to be transformed again by the next pair of hands that received it. No artifact that traveled the Silk Road arrived at its destination unchanged. Every object was recontextualized by its new setting, its meaning shifted by the expectations and associations of its new owners. A bolt of Chinese silk that was a government-issued salary in Chang'an became a diplomatic gift in Samarkand, a luxury commodity in Baghdad, and a sacred wrapping for a Christian relic in Constantinople. the same physical object carrying entirely different meanings at each stage of its journey. The Silk Road did not merely transmit culture, it transformed it at every node in the network through every hand it passed. Yeah. The modern scholarly understanding of the Silk Road owes an enormous debt to one figure whose contribution has already been mentioned in passing, but whose influence on how the world conceptualizes the Silk Road demands a fuller reckoning. Ferdinand von Richthofen, the German geographer who coined the term Seidenstrasse in 1877, did not merely name the Silk Road. He created the conceptual framework within which it has been understood ever since. Richthofen was a geologist and geographer who spent 4 years traveling in China between 1868 and 1872, conducting the first systematic geological survey of the country. His multi-volume work, China, the results of my travels and the studies based thereon, published between 1877 and 1912, was a landmark of geographical scholarship that mapped China's physical geography, mineral resources, and transportation networks with unprecedented detail. It was in this work that Richthofen introduced the term Silk Road to describe the ancient trade routes connecting China with the Western world. Richthofen's concept was, in some respects, a simplification. He envisioned a single primary route, a road, running from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean, with silk as its defining commodity. The reality, as we have seen, was far more complex, a web of routes rather than a single road, carrying a vast array of goods rather than just silk, with maritime and overland branches that shifted and branched over time. The term Silk Road has been criticized by some modern scholars as misleadingly singular and Eurocentric, implying a fixed pathway rather than a fluid network, and privileging the commodity that was most exotic to European consumers rather than the goods or horses, paper, spices, ideas that may have been more consequential in the long run. Yet the term endured, and it endured because it captured something essential about the phenomenon it described. The Silk Road was, at its core, about connection, about the human impulse to reach beyond the known, to trade with strangers, to exchange not just goods but ways of understanding the world. Silk Road as a name may be imprecise, but as a metaphor it is almost perfect. A shimmering thread stretching across the breadth of Eurasia, fragile but resilient, beautiful but functional, connecting civilizations that could not have imagined each other's existence. Richthofen's term gave the world a way to think about something that had previously had no name. The 2,000-year process by which the civilizations of the Eastern and Western hemispheres became aware of each other, influenced each other, and ultimately transformed each other through the medium of exchange. The scholarly study of the Silk Road expanded dramatically in the 20th century, driven by the archaeological discoveries of the early 1900s and by the growing recognition that the history of Eurasian connectivity was not a footnote to the histories of individual civilizations, but a subject of fundamental importance in its own right. Scholars in China, Japan, Europe, Russia, and the United States contributed to a rapidly growing body of knowledge about the Silk Road's roots, its goods, its peoples, and its cultural impacts. The field drew on expertise from a staggering range of disciplines: archaeology, art history, linguistics, religious studies, economic history, climatology, epidemiology, genetics, and materials science, reflecting the Silk Road's own multidimensional nature as a phenomenon that touched every aspect of human life. The decipherment of the dead languages of the Silk Road was one of the field's most remarkable achievements. The manuscripts recovered from sites like Dunhuang and Turfan included texts in languages that had been extinct for centuries: Tocharian, Khotanese, Sogdian, Tangut, and others, whose decipherment required feats of linguistic detective work comparable to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics or Mesopotamian cuneiform. Tocharian, in particular, it produced one of the great surprises in the history of linguistics. It was an Indo-European language, related, however distantly, to Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, spoken by a people who lived in the Tarim Basin on the eastern fringes of Central Asia, far closer to China than to any other Indo-European speaking population. The discovery of Tocharian demonstrated that the Silk Road's cultural mixing extended back to prehistoric times, long before any organized trade network existed, and that the population of Central Asia had always been more linguistically and ethnically diverse than anyone had suspected. DNA analysis of mummies recovered from the Tarim Basin, remarkably preserved by the desert's extreme aridity, confirmed the linguistic evidence. The so-called Tarim mummies, dating from approximately 1800 BCE to 200 CE, display a range of physical characteristics suggesting both Western Eurasian and Eastern Eurasian ancestry, with some of the earliest mummies showing predominantly European features: light hair, tall stature, and facial structures consistent with Northern European or Central Asian populations. These mummies predate the Silk Road by millennia, but they testify to the deep antiquity of the human movements and interactions that the Silk Road would eventually formalize and accelerate. Central Asia was not a barrier between civilizations. It was and had always been a meeting ground. The story of the Silk Road's modern afterlife is not confined to museums and academic journals. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Silk Road has been invoked, reimagined, and repurposed by political actors seeking to harness its symbolic power for contemporary purposes. The Soviet Union, which controlled most of Central Asia from the 1920s until its dissolution in 1991, had an ambivalent relationship with the Silk Road's legacy. On one hand, Soviet archaeologists and historians made significant contributions to Silk Road scholarship, excavating major sites, preserving manuscripts, and producing detailed studies of Central Asian history and culture. On the other hand, Soviet nationalities policy, which divided Central Asia into ethnically defined republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, imposed modern national boundaries on a region whose historical identity had been defined not by ethnicity, but by the network of trade and cultural exchange that the Silk Road represented. The Soviet period simultaneously preserved and distorted the Silk Road's legacy, making its physical remains accessible to scholarship while obscuring its historical significance within a Marxist framework that treated long-distance trade as an exploitative mechanism rather than a creative one. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 released the newly independent Central Asian states into a world that was, for the first time in centuries, eager to hear what they had to say about themselves. The Silk Road became, almost overnight, the central metaphor of Central Asian national identity. Uzbekistan promoted Samarkand and Bukhara as jewels of the Silk Road heritage. Turkmenistan claimed the ancient city of Merv, once one of the largest cities in the world, as a cornerstone of national pride. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan all invested in Silk Road tourism and cultural promotion, recognizing that the Silk Road brand carried an international recognition and romantic appeal that their individual national histories could not match. The most ambitious modern invocation of the Silk Road is China's Belt and Road Initiative, announced by President Xi Jinping in 2013. The BRI, originally called One Belt, One Road, explicitly invokes the historical Silk Road as a precedent and inspiration for a vast program of infrastructure investment connecting China with Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe through both overland routes, the Belt, and maritime channels, the Road. The initiative encompasses investments in railways, highways, ports, pipelines, fiber optic cables, and economic development zones across more than 60 countries, at a projected cost that may ultimately exceed $1 trillion. The BRI's invocation of the Silk Road is deliberate and strategic. By framing its 21st century infrastructure investments as a continuation of the ancient Silk Road, China claims a historical mandate for its current global ambitions, positioning itself not as a rising power seeking to displace the existing international order, but as the restorer of an ancient network of connectivity that benefited all the civilizations it touched. The historical analogy is powerful but imperfect. The ancient Silk Road was not a state-directed enterprise but an organic network created by millions of individual decisions. It was not controlled by any single power. It enriched middlemen and peripheral communities as much as it enriched the great empires at its termini. and its most consequential effects, the spread of religions, the transfer of technologies, the transmission of diseases, were unplanned and often unwelcome. Whether the Belt and Road Initiative will create a genuine new Silk Road, a network of mutual benefit connecting diverse civilizations through trade and cultural exchange, or whether it will function primarily as an instrument of Chinese economic and political influence is a question that only the future can answer. What is certain is that the Silk Road, as a concept and a symbol, it retains a power in the 21st century that its original architects could never have imagined. The name that Richthofen coined in 1877 has become one of the most resonant metaphors in contemporary geopolitics, invoked by politicians, journalists, and scholars to describe everything from transnational infrastructure projects to fiber optic submarine cables to the movement of digital information across borders. The Silk Road has transcended its historical origins to become a shorthand for connectivity itself, for the idea that human civilization is enriched by exchange and diminished by isolation. But the Silk Road's modern resonance is not limited to geopolitics and grand strategy. It lives in quieter, more intimate ways, in the daily habits and cultural practices of billions of people who have no idea that the Silk Road shaped their lives. Consider tea. The tea plant, Camellia sinensis chamarisin, is native to the borderlands between China, Myanmar, and India. Its cultivation and consumption originated in China, where tea drinking was established as a cultural practice by the Tang dynasty and elevated to a sophisticated art form during the Song dynasty. Tea traveled the Silk Road in multiple directions. It moved northward into the steppe, where it became the preferred beverage of the Turkic and Mongol peoples, traded for horses and livestock in the tea horse road that connected southern China with the Tibetan Plateau and the northern grasslands. It moved westward into Central Asia, where it was adopted by the Persians, the Arabs, and eventually the Turks, each culture adapting the preparation and consumption of tea to its own aesthetic and social conventions. It reached Europe in the 16th century, carried by Dutch and Portuguese traders who had encountered it in Chinese ports, and within 2 centuries it had transformed the social life of England, creating the institution of afternoon tea, fueling the demand for sugar that drove the Atlantic slave trade, and precipitating the political crisis, the Boston Tea Party, that helped trigger the American Revolution. The journey of tea from a Chinese mountain shrub to a global commodity is a Silk Road story in miniature, a demonstration of how a single cultural practice, transmitted through networks of trade and exchange, can ramify through distant civilizations in ways that no one could have predicted. The British Empire's addiction to tea was at several removes a consequence of the same transcontinental connectivity that Zhang Qian had initiated when he walked through the Jade Gate. The chain of causation is indirect, mediated by centuries and thousands of kilometers of intervening history, but it is real. The connections are traceable. The Silk Road's effects did not stop at its geographical boundaries or its historical endpoints. They propagated outward through time and space like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Consider the noodle. The origin of pasta is one of the most contentious topics in food history, with Italian, Chinese, and Arab advocates all claiming priority. The historical evidence suggests that noodle-like foods were developed independently in multiple cultures. But the spread of noodle-making techniques across Eurasia, from China westward through Central Asia, into the Persian and Arab culinary traditions, and eventually into the Italian kitchen, follows the Silk Road with suspicious precision. A 4,000-year-old bowl of noodles made from millet flour was discovered at the archaeological site of Lajia in northwestern China in 2005, the oldest known noodles in the world. Arab culinary texts from the medieval period describe dried pasta products that closely resemble Chinese noodle forms. Italian pasta, in its earliest documented forms, appears in regions, Sicily, Sardinia, that had sustained contact with the Arab world. The chain of transmission is not proven beyond doubt, but the circumstantial evidence is strong, and the geography is suggestive. Pasta may be the Silk Road's most delicious legacy. Consider music. The instruments of the modern orchestra trace lineages that run, in several cases, directly along the Silk Road. The lute, ancestor of the guitar, the mandolin, and a family of stringed instruments played across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, derives its name from the Arabic al-ud, which itself descended from the Persian barbat, which was influenced by Central Asian stringed instruments that had absorbed design elements from Chinese prototypes. The oboe descends from the zurna, a double reed instrument of Central Asian origin that traveled the Silk Road in both directions, appearing in Chinese court orchestras as the suona and in European military bands as the sham. And the fiddle, the ancestor of the modern violin, has roots in the Central Asian Comanche and the Arab rabab, both of which developed along the Silk Road's musical highways and were transmitted westward by Arab and Turkic musicians. When a symphony orchestra performs today, it is performing on instruments whose lineages connect through centuries of adaptation and transmission to the same network of exchange that carried silk and spices across the ancient world. Consider the alphabet. The Latin script in which this text is written descends from the Roman alphabet, which descended from the Greek alphabet, which descended from the Phoenician alphabet, which descended from the Proto-Sinaitic script of the 2nd millennium BCE. But the Silk Road carried alphabetic writing systems into regions far beyond this Mediterranean lineage. In the Sogdian script, used by the merchant princes of the Silk Road for centuries, descended from Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Near East, which itself descended from the Phoenician alphabet. From Sogdian descended the Old Uyghur script, used by the Turkic Uyghur people of Central Asia. And from Old Uyghur descended the Mongolian script adopted by the Mongol Empire in the 13th century and still used in Inner Mongolia today. The chain of transmission, Phoenician to Aramaic to Sogdian to Uyghur to Mongolian, traces a path directly along the Silk Road, carrying the technology of alphabetic writing from the Mediterranean to the Mongolian steppe. Every time a Mongolian herder writes a text message in the traditional Mongolian script, he is using a writing system whose ancestry connects him, and through 2,000 years of Silk Road transmission, to the ancient Phoenician traders of the Mediterranean coast. These examples could be multiplied endlessly. The spread of astronomical knowledge from Mesopotamia through Persia and India to China and back again. The transmission of medical practices, acupuncture traveling westward, humoral medicine traveling eastward, the global dissemination of chess, a game that originated in India, was adopted by the Persians, transmitted to the Arabs, carried to Europe by Islamic civilization, and introduced to China along the Silk Road in a variant form. The spread of metalworking techniques, agricultural practices, architectural styles, mathematical concepts, and philosophical ideas, each of these followed pathways that the Silk Road had created or accelerated, and each left marks on the civilizations it touched that remain visible today. The Silk Road also carried something more subtle and more pervasive than any single commodity or cultural practice. It carried the idea of the other, the awareness that beyond the horizon, beyond the desert, beyond the mountains and the sea, there existed people who lived differently, thought differently, worshiped differently, and yet were recognizably, irreducibly human. This awareness was not always comfortable. It could produce fear, contempt, and violence as easily as it could produce curiosity, admiration, and exchange. The history of the Silk Road includes episodes of slaughter and enslavement alongside episodes of dialogue and mutual enrichment. The Mongol destruction of Khwarezmia, the Portuguese bombardment of Calicut, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. These are as much a part of the Silk Road's legacy as the cave paintings of Dunhuang or the translation movement of Baghdad. But the net effect of the Silk Road's 2 millennia of connectivity was to make it impossible for any civilization to believe for very long that it was alone in the world. The Silk Road was the cure for insularity. It taught, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally, that every civilization existed within a larger web of human activity, and that isolation was neither natural nor sustainable. The Chinese court that sent Jiang Qian westward was acting on the assumption that the world beyond the Jade Gate contained potential allies. The Roman Senate that debated the cost of silk imports was acknowledging, however reluctantly, that its citizens' desires were shaped by goods produced thousands of kilometers away. The Buddhist monks who traveled from India to China and back were enacting the conviction that truth was universal, that it transcended cultural boundaries, and that it could be sought wherever the roads led. This conviction that the world is connected, that what happens in distant places matters here, that human civilization is a single story told in many languages, is the Silk Road's deepest and most enduring legacy. It is the conviction that underlies modern globalization, modern science, modern diplomacy, and the modern ideal of cultural exchange. It is not a conviction that the Silk Road invented. Human beings have always known at some level that they are not alone, but the Silk Road made that knowledge concrete. It gave it physical form. In the silk and spices and jade and glass that moved along its routes, in the temples and mosques and churches that lined its path, in the manuscripts and paintings and sculptures that recorded its passage. The Silk Road proved over 2,000 years and 7,000 kilometers that connection was possible, that it was profitable, and that it could transform the world. There is one more dimension of the Silk Road's legacy that demands attention, not because it has been neglected by scholars, but because its full significance is only now becoming apparent. The Silk Road was, among other things, an ecological event, a force that reshaped the natural world as profoundly as it reshaped the human one. The movement of plants along the Silk Road was one of the most consequential and least recognized processes in environmental history. The crops that feed the modern world are in many cases products of Silk Road exchange. Wheat, which originated in the Fertile Crescent, traveled the Silk Road eastward into China, where it became a staple grain or remains, the foundation of the noodle and dumpling traditions that define northern Chinese cuisine. Rice, which originated in the Yangtze River Valley, traveled westward along the Silk Road and its maritime extensions, eventually reaching the Middle East, North Africa, and southern Europe. The grapevine, native to the Caucasus region, or roughly, traveled the Silk Road eastward into Central Asia and China, where Jiang Qian himself had noted the grape wine of Fergana with such fascination. Peaches, a native to China, traveled westward along the Silk Road through Persia. Their very name in many European languages derives from Persia via Latin Persica, and eventually reached the Mediterranean and Europe. Apricots followed a similar path, their name in several European languages reflecting their association with the Arabic albark. Cotton, cultivated in India, spread both eastward and westward along the Silk Road, eventually becoming the world's most important textile fiber. Sesame, native to Africa and South Asia, traveled the Silk Road into China, where it became sesame oil, a fundamental ingredient in Chinese cooking. The list extends far beyond food crops. Decorative plants, roses, tulips, jasmine, chrysanthemums, traveled the Silk Road and were adopted into the horticultural traditions of every civilization they reached. Medicinal plants, rhubarb, ginseng, camphor, ephedra, moved along the routes in both directions, enriching the pharmacopoeias of Chinese, Indian, Persian, and European medicine. Timber species, fodder crops, and fiber plants all participated in the slow botanical migration that the Silk Road facilitated over centuries. Animals, too, moved along the Silk Road, with consequences that reshaped the economies and cultures of the regions that received them. The heavenly horses of Fergana, which had so entranced Jiang Qian, were only the most famous example. Bactrian camels, the beasts that had made the Silk Road physically possible, were bred and distributed along the routes. Their genetic lines managed by nomadic herders whose breeding knowledge was as closely guarded as any trade secret. Falcons, prized for hunting by the aristocracies of both China and the Islamic world, were traded along the Silk Road in sufficient quantities that falconry manuals from different cultures show remarkable convergences in technique and terminology. Silkworms themselves, The Bombyx Mori, whose cocoons had started the whole enterprise, were eventually smuggled out of China, breaking the Chinese monopoly and establishing sericulture first in Central Asia, then in Persia, then in Byzantium, and finally in Italy, where silk production became a major industry by the medieval period. And then there were the invisible travelers, the microbes. The Silk Road was a highway for disease, and its epidemiological impacts were, at times, more consequential than all its commercial and cultural effects combined. The Black Death of the 14th century, which we have already discussed, was the most dramatic but not the only example. Smallpox, measles, and influenza all appear to have spread along Silk Road routes during various historical periods, their movement facilitated by the same networks of human contact that facilitated the movement of goods and ideas. The epidemiological history of the Silk Road is still being written, as modern genetic analysis of ancient pathogens recovered from burial sites along the routes reveals new information about the timing, direction, and impact of disease transmission across the ancient world. The ecological dimension of the Silk Road challenges the comfortable notion that transcontinental exchange was an unambiguous good. The movement of plants and animals enriched agriculture and diet across Eurasia, but it also disrupted ecosystems. It introduced invasive species and facilitated the spread of crop diseases that could devastate the food supply of entire regions. The movement of pathogens killed millions and reshaped the demographic balance of continents. The environmental history of the Silk Road is a story of transformation, not improvement, a story in which every gain was accompanied by a loss, every benefit by a cost, every connection by a vulnerability. This ecological ambivalence mirrors the broader moral ambivalence of the Silk Road itself. The network that carried Buddhism also carried plague. The routes that enriched oasis communities also made them dependent on forces beyond their control. The connectivity that broadened human horizons also created the channels through which human violence could project itself across previously unbridgeable distances. The Silk Road was not a force for good or a force for evil. It was a force, a vast impersonal amplifier of human capacity, magnifying both the best and the worst of what human beings are capable of. The oasis cities that the Silk Road sustained are largely quiet today. Dunhuang remains a small city on the edge of the desert. Its economy sustained more by tourism to the Mogao caves than by any modern equivalent of the trade that once made it a critical waypoint. Kashgar, at the western edge of the Taklamakan, is a city of over 500,000 people, but its old city, the mud brick labyrinth that had housed merchant communities for centuries, was largely demolished in the early 21st century and replaced with modern construction. It's a process that some praised as necessary modernization and others mourned as the destruction of an irreplaceable historical environment. Samarkand and Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan preserve their great Islamic monuments. The Registan, the Bibi Kanyam Mosque, the Kalyan Minaret, as tourist attractions and symbols of national heritage. But the living commercial culture that created them has long since vanished. The caravanserais are empty, the merchants are gone. The camels have been replaced by trucks and trains that bypass the old oasis towns entirely, moving goods along highways and railways that follow different logic than the ancient routes. And yet the old routes are not entirely dead. In the bazaars of Kashgar, Uyghur merchants still sell dried fruits and nuts that have been staples of Central Asian trade for millennia. Apricots, almonds, raisins, walnuts, products whose journey from the orchards of the Fergana Valley to the markets of Western China follows pathways that Jiang Qian himself would recognize. In the tea houses of Bukhara, men still sit on low platforms drinking tea and conducting business in a style that has not fundamentally changed in centuries. In the workshops of Khotan, jade carvers still work the nephrite jade that has been extracted from the riverbeds of the Kunlun Mountains since the 3rd millennium BCE, shaping it into objects that would not look out of place in a Han Dynasty tomb. These continuities are not nostalgic fantasies. They are evidence of something stubborn and irreducible in the Silk Road's legacy. The persistence of patterns of human interaction that outlast the political and economic systems that created them. The Silk Road may have been born from imperial ambition and sustained by commercial profit, but its deepest roots were in simpler human realities. The desire for variety, the pleasure of novelty, the satisfaction of exchange, the fundamental human need to know what lies beyond the next mountain. These impulses did not disappear when the sea routes made the overland caravans obsolete. They found new channels, new media, new forms. But they remained at their core the same impulses that had driven Zheng Qian through the Jade Gate and onto the road that would connect half the world. In the archives of the British Library in London, there is a scroll of mulberry bark paper, hand-printed in Chinese ink, bearing the text of the Diamond Sutra, the Vajraketaka Prajnaparamita Sutra, a Buddhist philosophical text that explores the nature of reality, the illusoriness of perception, and the path to enlightenment through the perfection of wisdom. The scroll measures approximately 5 meters long and 30 centimeters high. Its colophon, the note at the end identifying its production, states that it was printed on the 15th day of the 4th month of the 9th year of the Xiantong era, May 11th, 868 CE, by one Wang Jie, for free distribution on behalf of his 2 parents. It is the oldest dated printed book in the world. The Diamond Sutra was found in Cave 17 at Dunhuang, the sealed library cave that Oral Stein accessed in 1907. It had lain in darkness for approximately 900 years before Stein's lamp illuminated it. In those 9 centuries, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires had risen and fallen. Technologies had been invented and forgotten and reinvented. The Silk Road that had carried Buddhism from India to China, that had created the demand for Buddhist texts that led to the development of printing technology, that had produced the paper on which the Diamond Sutra was printed, that Silk Road had flourished, declined, and passed into memory. But the text itself endures. And what the text says is, in a way, the most fitting epitaph for the Silk Road that anyone could compose. The Diamond Sutra teaches that all phenomena are transient, that all forms arise, persist for a time, and pass away. It teaches that attachment to impermanent things is the root of suffering. And it teaches that wisdom lies in seeing through the illusion of permanence to the luminous emptiness that underlies all things. The Silk Road itself arose, persisted for 2 millennia, and passed away. The cities it built have crumbled. The caravans it sustained have vanished. The empires that protected it have dissolved into the dust of archives and the silence of abandoned capitals. Even the desert sands that buried its ruins are themselves impermanent, shifting, drifting, occasionally revealing a fragment of wall or a shard of pottery before covering them again. And yet what the Silk Road transmitted, the ideas, the beliefs, the technologies, the artistic traditions, the foods, the musical instruments, the alphabets, the mathematical concepts, the stories, these endure. They have become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of human civilization that they are invisible as the air we breathe or the gravity that holds us to the earth. We do not notice the Silk Road's legacy because we cannot imagine the world without it. We cannot imagine a world in which Buddhism remained an Indian religion, in which Europeans counted in Roman numerals, in which Chinese cuisine lacked wheat and grapes, in which the symphony orchestra had never been invented, in which the concept of zero had never crossed from India to the Islamic world to Europe. The Silk Road created the world we live in, not single-handedly, not deliberately, and not without immeasurable cost, but inescapably. There is a passage in the Shiji, Sima Qian's great history, on the same text that preserves the earliest account of Zhang Qian's journey, where the historian reflects on the nature of his own work. He writes that his purpose is to examine the deeds and events of the past and investigate the principles behind their success and failure, their rise and decay. He writes, in other words, as a man who believes that the past has principles, that it is not merely a succession of random events, but a pattern from which wisdom can be extracted. The Silk Road invites a similar belief. Its 2,000-year history is not a simple narrative of progress or decline. It is a pattern, a demonstration, repeated across centuries and civilizations, of certain fundamental truths about human life. That isolation impoverishes and connection enriches. That exchange is never purely commercial. That goods carry ideas. Yeah, and ideas transform societies. That connectivity creates vulnerability as surely as it creates prosperity. That the greatest achievements of human civilization, the philosophical systems, the artistic traditions, the scientific discoveries, the technologies, are almost never the products of a single culture working in isolation, but the results of interaction, borrowing, adaptation, and synthesis across cultural boundaries. That the desire to know what lies beyond the horizon is one of the deepest and most persistent of human drives, and that the satisfaction of that desire, always without exception, transforms both the seeker and the sought. These are not new insights. They are as old as the Silk Road itself, but they bear repeating because the forces that built the Silk Road, curiosity, ambition, greed, faith, the longing for the beautiful and the rare, are the same forces that shape our world today. The fiber optic cables that carry the internet beneath the world's oceans are, in a sense, the modern Silk Road, channels of connectivity that transmit not silk and spices, but information, and that generate, like their ancient predecessor, both extraordinary benefits and extraordinary risks. The container ships that carry Chinese manufactured goods to ports in Europe and America are following by sea the same basic economic logic that drove camel caravans across the Taklamakan. The logic of comparative advantage, of producing where costs are low and selling where prices are high, of profiting from the differential between one market and another. The parallels are not exact. They never are. History does not repeat itself with the mechanical precision of a clock, but it rhymes, as the saying goes, and the Silk Road's rhymes are audible to anyone who listens. The tensions between free trade and protectionism that dominate 21st century geopolitics have their ancestors in the Han Dynasty's debate over how to manage the Xiongnu frontier. The disruptions of the global supply chain that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed in 2020 have their ancestors in the disruptions that the Black Death inflicted on Silk Road trade in the 14th century. The cultural anxieties that accompany globalization, the fear of foreign influence, the resentment of economic dependency, the nostalgia for a simpler and more self-sufficient past have their ancestors in the Tang Dynasty's periodic persecutions of foreign religions and the Roman Senate's futile attempts to ban silk. The Silk Road teaches that these tensions are permanent features of human life, that they arise wherever connectivity exists and that they can be managed but never eliminated. The question is never whether to connect or to isolate. The question is how to connect wisely, how to capture the benefits of exchange while managing its risks, how to maintain cultural identity while remaining open to foreign influence, how to build networks that are resilient enough to survive disruption and flexible enough to adapt to change. The ancient Silk Road answered these questions imperfectly, as all human institutions do. It enriched some and impoverished others. It spread beauty and it spread death. It connected civilizations and it destroyed them. But its imperfections do not diminish its achievement. For 2,000 years, across 7,000 kilometers of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, human beings maintained a network of exchange that transmitted not just goods but the accumulated wisdom and creativity of half the world's civilizations. They did this without satellites, without telecommunications, without engines or electricity or any of the technologies that make modern global connectivity possible. They did it with camels and caravanserais, with relay stations and sailing ships, with patience and courage and the willingness to walk into the unknown. The last caravan to travel the full overland Silk Road is not recorded in any historical source because the Silk Road did not end with a final journey. It ended with an absence, the gradual thinning of traffic, the slow emptying of roads, the quiet closing of caravanserai doors that would not open again. There was no last camel bell. There was no final merchant who looked back over his shoulder at the receding walls of Dunhuang and knew that no one would follow. The road simply grew quieter, season by season, decade by decade, until the silence was complete. But silence in the desert is never truly complete. The wind still moves, the sand still shifts, the stars still turn above the Taklamakan in patterns that have not changed since Zhang Qian navigated by them, since Xuanzang prayed beneath them. Since nameless Sogdian merchants counted their profits by their light, the desert does not know that the caravans have stopped. It does not know that the relay stations have crumbled, that the oasis wells have silted up, that the languages once spoken in its trading posts have fallen silent. The desert simply is, vast, indifferent, patient, as it was before the first merchant loaded the first camel, and as it will be long after the last trace of human passage has been erased by the wind. And somewhere beneath the sand, perhaps at a depth of 1 meter, perhaps 10, lie the remains of what passed here. A fragment of Chinese silk, its dye faded, but its fibers still intact, preserved by the desert's extreme aridity. A Sassanid silver coin, its inscription still legible to a trained eye, a shard of Roman glass. Its surface iridescent with the patina of 2,000 years, a Buddhist prayer scroll, its Sanskrit verses still readable by a scholar with patience and a magnifying glass. A Sogdian merchant's letter, complaining about unpaid debts and unreliable business partners, its frustration as fresh as the day it was written. These objects are the Silk Road's physical memory, the material evidence that this network existed, that it mattered, and that the people who created it were not abstractions, but human beings with names and faces and hopes and grievances and all the messy complexity of actual human life. They traded silk and spices, yes. They carried religions and alphabets and mathematical concepts across the breadth of the known world. They facilitated the movement of armies and the spread of empires and the transmission of plagues that killed millions. But they also wrote love letters and complained about their debts and worried about their children and argued with their spouses and got drunk on wine from grapes that had traveled 1,000 kilometers to reach their cups. They were, in every way that matters, us. Separated by centuries and thousands of kilometers, but connected by the same needs, the same desires, the same irreducible humanity. The Silk Road is gone. The connections it created are not. They pulse through the modern world in forms that Zhang Qian could never have imagined, but would perhaps have recognized in the impulse behind them, if not in their specific manifestation. The impulse to know, the impulse to trade, the impulse to reach beyond the familiar and grasp something new. The impulse that drove a young man to accept a jade staff, walk through a gate, and keep walking into the silence until the silence began to answer back. The Taklamakan is quiet tonight. The dunes are silver in the moonlight, curved and smooth, shaped by a wind that has been blowing since before there were human beings to feel it on their faces. There are no camels on the horizon, no jingle of harness bells, no creak of leather or murmur of conversation in languages that died 1,000 years ago. There is only the sand and the wind and the stars and the vast patient silence of a landscape that once carried the world's hopes and sorrows and ambitions across its back, and that now carries only the memory of having done so. It is enough. The memory is enough. Because what the Silk Road proved, what 2,000 years of caravans and monks and merchants and soldiers and pilgrims and translators and artists and bandits and diplomats proved, is that human beings will always find a way to connect. The routes change. The technologies change. The goods and the ideas and the diseases change. But the impulse does not change. The impulse is as old as the species and as deep as the need for air. We reach out. We trade, we talk, we teach, we learn, we carry things across impossible distances for reasons that are sometimes noble and sometimes venal and sometimes simply human. The desire to see what is there, to know what others know, to taste what others taste, to hold in our hands something that was made by hands we will never touch, in a place we will never visit, by a person whose name we will never learn. That is the Silk Road, not a road, not a network, not a concept or a metaphor or a geopolitical strategy. It is an impulse, the oldest and most human impulse there is. The impulse that sent Jiang Qian through the Jade Gate and into the unknown. The impulse that carried Buddhist sutras from India to China and Chinese porcelain from Jingdezhen to Cairo. The impulse that moved silk from cocoon to loom to camel to market to Roman shoulder, passing through 100 hands in 100 towns across 100 seasons, each hand adding something, a fold, a price, a story, a stain from the road, until the final garment contained within its threads the labor and the longing of half a continent. The wind moves across the dunes, the sand whispers. The stars burn in the black dome of the Central Asian sky, the same stars that have always been there, the same stars that Jiang Qian steered by on his way home after 13 years in the wilderness, gaunt and weathered, and carrying nothing but a jade staff and a memory of the world's immensity. He brought back a map. Not a map drawn on paper. Paper had not yet been invented, at least not in the form that would later travel the Silk Road from China to Samarkand to Baghdad to Cairo to Europe. He brought back a map drawn in words, a description of the world that was larger and richer and more astonishing than anything the Chinese court had imagined. And because he brought it back, because he survived the desert, and the captivity and the mountains and the return, the world cracked open. The known expanded into the unknown. Yes, and the unknown became, in time, the known. The Silk Road was born not from the first trade or the first caravan, but from the first report, and from one man standing before an emperor and saying, "The world is bigger than you think, and it is full of wonders. The world is still bigger than we think. It is still full of wonders. And the roads that connect its wonders, overland and undersea, digital and physical, visible and invisible, are still, in their deepest essence, the Silk Road. They are still the answer to the same question that drove Jiang Qian into the desert. What is out there? The desert knows. It has always known. It held the answer in its sand for 2,000 years, and it holds it still. In fragments of silk and shards of glass, and the faint, faint echo of camel bells that may be the wind or may be memory. Or maybe the sound of the world still reaching, still connecting, still carrying its hopes across the silence toward a horizon that never arrives and never stops beckoning. The stars turn, the wind settles, the sand grows still, and somewhere, in the quiet between one breath and the next, the road goes on.